Just a quick walk through the agenda. We're starting with our annual roundtable discussion of stakeholder policy priorities. And John Rumble, who's the sector liaison, a sector liaison for the CAISO PTO sector, will be leading that along with Josh Walter, who is an EIM entities sector and liaison, and Josh is online this morning. We'll follow that with a discussion involving a number of us RIF liaisons on the RIF enhancements discussion paper, which we released on Monday, April 7th. It's posted to the Regional Issues Forum page of the Western Energy Markets website. And that paper discusses some potential modifications to the role of the Regional Issues Forum within CAISO stakeholder processes, as well as some steps that we could consider taking in order to transition the RIF to the Stakeholder Representatives Committee under the West-Wide Governance Pathways Initiative Step 2 final proposal. So we'll have a conversation outlining some of the issues that we're considering in that paper. And then finally, Ali Mace and Vijay Satyal. Vijay is a sector liaison for the public interest organizations, will be leading a panel discussion that's going to be the first of a two-part series dealing with market seams related issues. So with that, since we have a pretty full agenda, I'm going to turn things over to John to kick things off and get us started on the roundtable.
Okay, thank you very much. Josh, are you unmuted?
I'm here, ready to go.
Okay, well then I will virtually point to you to kick us off. What should we move to slide number 4, please?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. Really quick, we are planning on doing an overview of the feedback we each received from our respective sectors on the annual roundtable roadmap and priorities process. So with that, I think we'll try and make up a little bit of time here. But the idea is to do a brief overview, then give each of the liaisons an opportunity to present feedback that they received from individual sector members, then come back with some opportunity for comments and feedback, and then talk through next steps and close out this portion of the conversation. So let's move to the next slide, please. So this is the second year that we've operated as a RIF and the RIF liaisons of the roundtable discussion on the feedback and the process of CAISO's proposed catalog and priorities. So we've compiled feedback that each of us have requested from our respective sectors, plan to review those items, and then following today's discussion, we're planning on creating a written report, and then also recognizing that throughout this process, it still is a bit new, right? As I mentioned, this is the second year that we've done this, but also, I think as a helpful direct communication piece and advocacy piece for the deliberative process with the governing body and for feedback to CAISO. So from there, we want to make it clear and apparent that this is an iterative and annual process that we hope to continue to work to improve and perfect. So with that, let's move to the next slide. As a sector liaison for the EIM entity, I'll go over the feedback and then move on to other liaisons. So next slide. So our feedback was interesting, still maybe a little bit light in the number of responses we received from EIM entities, but on an overall basis, feedback received that we are, certain members are happy that the CAISO efforts in the catalog and road have been open and receptive to feedback on an overall basis. The other, at least from a process basis, the catalog timeline and initiative grouping methodology looks to be well structured as well as transparent. Next slide, please. Getting into some of the detail, I think that similar to earlier comments, the idea that this is iterative, this is something that continues to grow. There were notes that the 24 policy roadmap appeared to be underrepresentative of EIM entity initiatives or Western Energy Imbalance Market initiatives that were proposed outside of CAISO. There was support for the current roadmap prioritization that reflects the issues that are important to the multiple and varied sectors, and some appreciation for CAISO to demonstrate its nimbleness in the stakeholder process that we can maybe highlight in the next slide. So, I do think that there is some built-in, what we are seeing is some built-in flexibility to shift and work through regional priorities. So next slide, please. I think that's evidenced here in the new initiative priorities list that we received, namely with the first piece, the EDAM congestion revenue allocation enhancements. There was a request from EIM entities that this be taken up as a priority, which we have seen over the course of the last couple of weeks that a process has been initiated to review the congestion revenue allocation process in EDAM. So that was highlighted even prior to the announcement for the stakeholder initiative, and again is a highlight of the nimbleness of CAISO. EDAM intertype bidding was another piece that was highlighted from the sector. Market seams and working through seams related issues in the potential for multiple markets to emerge in the West. One highlight is that the idea of seams having an impact on OAT and OAT implementation from other entities was mentioned as a component of the seams work. And then from a timing perspective and an opportunity for making sure that the current initiatives are adequately addressed, there was a recommendation to be cognizant of time and effort required to participate in the stakeholder processes and to work through current initiatives and limit the number of new initiatives that CAISO takes on, because we are seeing a significant amount of processes that are in the formation stage, and working through those to completion was highlighted. Next slide, please. So no other high priority issues were identified. I think that list was relatively robust, and also recognized that the CAISO is working towards positive steps in addressing past and current stakeholder needs. I believe that this is my last slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll kind of usher us through the remaining liaisons, sectors and liaisons. So the next folks are the CAISO PTOs.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, I'm John Rumble from Southern California Edison. Can we go to the next slide, please? Representing the California participating transmission owner sector here. And at a high level from the initiative process, the PTO sector is happy with, you know, the collaboration, increased collaboration of the past couple of years, especially that we've seen. However, no member submitted any further initiatives for the next roadmap. And in particular, it was pointed out that resources are getting stretched, and that given the current set of work groups and the most recent sort of EDAM congestion allocation effort, members really are encouraging CAISO to either pause or maybe even conclude some of the initiatives that are taking up a lot of resources and are not necessarily need to be moving forward as quickly as maybe advertised. And everybody can sort of read what's on the slide, but I think the biggest focus that we would like to encourage CAISO in the next year and a half or year and a half is really maintaining that focus on getting EDAM up and running and right. And a lot of sort of trying to make adjustments to EDAM before it's even been rolled out is we would not, we're a little afraid of the distractions. And so we highly encourage CAISO just to make sure that the most important thing in the room gets to where it needs to be. And then, you know, as there's an evolution, as EDAM goes into place and as we have experience, then there should be some real opportunities to adjust and adapt as you know, issues or opportunities arise. So May of 2026 is a key focus date for us. Next slide, please. I moved my slides as well. I don't know why they don't have control of my computer. So just to reiterate, you know, many of us are feeling the sort of strain or in the PTO sector on the number of working groups, and don't feel as though we can adequately, sufficiently commit, you know, what would be the right amount of resources to some of these working groups. And we've had to prioritize. I know what Ed said, we've absolutely had to prioritize which working groups we pay closest attention to, and some of them have fallen back a little bit. And we don't think that's what the initiative process should be, where you know, key stakeholders, large stakeholders, any stakeholder really has to feel the pressure to back off when, you know, there are important things at stake. Next slide, please. Okay, and so just to put this in italics, whereas in the first page it was not in italics, we didn't submit any initiatives, and we definitely encourage the CAISO to maintain that focus on EDAM and not sort of allow too many distractions get in the way of a successful implementation in May 2026. Thank you. Josh, want to take us forward?
Yeah, thanks, John. I believe the COUs are next, so next slide.
Thanks. Warren Tenney Dennison. I'm from the Public Power Council and one of the liaisons for the consumer-owned utility sector, along with Doug Pochignone. And if we can move to the next slide. So on that theme of having enough time to meaningfully engage in processes, the COU sector really appreciates what CAISO staff is doing with the roadmap engagement, this process, the ability for the RIP to give feedback. But we observed that this time there was only one member of the COU sector that submitted comments. And I think part of that, talking through with the sector, is just that yearly updates might be a little bit too frequent to have that deep, meaningful engagement with the catalog, with everything else that's going on. We'd also observed that there are multiple paths to getting items addressed. We see that with like the EDAM congestion discussion that has already ended up, I think we have it as an existing initiative. I think somebody else just had it on the new initiative. It's kind of new and coming up. But maybe there's a potential to explore a lighter with mid-cycle review biannually. seeing what other sectors have to say and input on that, but that might allow us to engage a little bit more meaningfully and deeply on the reoccurring process for this review. But again, just want to really reiterate the opportunity to provide input both through this roadmap process, and then there's a bunch of other avenues too. And one other comment that came up in our discussions is that linking the roadmap back to the strategic plan and having a strategic plan refresh that supports that roadmap would also be helpful to just kind of pull it all together. If you could go to the next slide. So on current policy initiatives, we didn't have any written comments here, but there was broad support for taking up the EDAM congestion rent initiative. And I think, again, was that a new initiative or an existing initiative? But there were also some questions about, now this is coming forward, what else can we take a little pause on? I think the sector was pretty comfortable with taking a brief pause on some of the storage modeling enhancements and price formation work, acknowledging that we're really looking at that near-term EDAM congestion rent initiative to be through the end of May, so a couple months of where we might be able to take a little pause there. But there was also some questions about understanding the interim nature of this initiative versus a longer term solution. Folks were interested in seeing a longer term solution added to and incorporated into the roadmap. And with all the initiatives going on, there was also interest in crosswalking the EDAM congestion rent work with what's going on in the CRR enhancement initiative. There, the CRR enhancement initiative not directly being related to the EIM, but I think that there's some discussion and some general themes that would benefit from some crosswalk there. On the new initiative side, so the two initiatives that were identified by COU sector in comments and then in discussion received broad support amongst the sector was transmission access charge and the real-time congestion offset issues, and acknowledging that those aren't directly EIM related, but that they would have, we expect that they would have implications again there that would be important to crosswalk from work that's going on with the CAISO and the VA to efforts that are going on addressing issues. There's also broad support for the SEAMS issues that have been identified by some of the other sectors. Talking through that, we really wanted to see that SEAMS comes up as an issue, having some scoping incorporated as a first step into the roadmap. And when we talk about SEAMS tends to be kind of like a catch-all term for a lot of different things. And really that scoping as a first step would allow us to walk through what's a commercial SEAM versus an operational SEAM, and then part out a little bit more specifically how initiatives might flow out of. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, so sorry, I forgot to advance. I just looked at this one. So if you go to the next slide. Other high priority issues, a lot of appreciation for the work that CAISO staff is doing with the working groups and acknowledgement that this is a new and continuing and evolving process. And folks are really interested to see how that matures and evolves over time. Some of the questions we continue to have is how the working groups advance to the policy formation stage. I think we're just at the beginning of seeing how the first round of that happens, where the forming and storming of the working group period ends and it gets taken to an initiative. How does that work? How does CAISO staff determine that enough discussion has been done? Is there some role in the RIN or other stakeholder groups to help with the next step? And how can we be most efficient by preventing rehashing of issues during that next step? So folks haven't been engaged in the work groups. We don't want to have the same conversation again as once it becomes an initiative where a lot of that work has been done. And the areas of opportunity here, these were just an initial thought. I know folks in the sector have more ideas as well. We had a panel where we talked about this at the end of last year, but there's some additional areas of opportunity, perhaps with some more structured project management, having some more in-person engagements as part of the working groups. And, I think really respect what CAISO is doing in trying to bring forward the stakeholder voice, but there's still a role for CAISO staff and maybe setting the stage with some working group papers for folks to react to. So some initial thoughts there, again, to build on the success that is standing with these working groups. I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Lauren. Let's move on to the IPPs and marketers.
Thank you, Josh. So Hi, I'm Rahul Cluster. I work at AES. I'll be representing the IPP and marketer sector with Scott over here. So let's move to the next slide. So the IPP and marketer sector, we are the most diverse.
I don't know if we can, sorry, hold on, we just got saw a message on the WebEx if it's hard to hear. You might want to please speak up a little bit. We're talking, sorry, we're using the computer as our mic. So
You want to just
Should I slide it down?
we can take the cable off.
Oh, I don't think I can take it.
Okay,
okay?
Okay.
okay. Sorry. Continue on.
Okay.
Yeah, Zoom in. Sorry.
Okay. Just let me know if you can't hear me. So IPP and marketer sector, we are the most diverse sector in RIF. We have more than 80 entities registered in our sector. We have entities that own and operate renewables, fossil fuels, and energy storage resources. We have representation from power marketeers and financial institutions, demand response and virtual power plants, and trade associations that represent all of the above businesses. We have one connecting belief that well-functioning wholesale electricity market, is the foundation for reliable power and lower cost energy. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So we have received feedback from our sector about the CAISO's policy roadmap process. Most of the sector believes that there is sufficient time that's provided by CAISO to respond. And the annual process is useful for assuring time-sensitive items, and we can perceive new initiatives. A couple of recommendations from our sector is a need for a greater transparency of what is accepted versus what is rejected or paused, and also an assurance that the process is, takes care of both near-term and mid-term needs. So the idea is, we are looking for solutions. We not just look for short-term, but also look for mid-term need that may be coming over the horizon. Moving on to the next slide. So our sector was very much engaged last year, and we provided numerous policy proposals, which are listed mainly in these 5 buckets. It has governance enhancements, intertie bidding, non-generating resource enhancements, price formation enhancements, and transmission enhancements. And all those 5 buckets, CAISO has started initiatives or even come to a decent proposal or even a solution for the governance enhancements, the NGR resource enhancement, which started late last year, and then price formation enhancements. So these are some of the initiatives that CAISO has started based on feedback from our sector. If you can go to the next slide. So there are 2 other initiatives which were not selected last year. It's the intertie trading and bidding related issues, and then the transmission enhancements. So essentially, we found that the sector is engaged, provided feedback, and some of those initiatives didn't make it on the roadmap. And then I'll hand it off to Scott to cover our sector's feedback for this year.
Thank you, Rahul. We'll move to the next slide. When it comes to 2025 priorities for the independent power producers and marketers sector, we have 3 major areas: EDAM, energy storage, and then some refinements to the transmission planning process. One thing we want to highlight is that everything you see here are really just refinements and kind of really focusing in on items that the California ISO has already started. We really want to commend the California ISO for starting work in all of these areas. And as our stakeholders are working through a lot of these topics, Josh Walter in the EIM sector had mentioned pretty much all of these items for EDAM. We were ready to come in guns blazing and go after the ISO for not doing more on congestion. And we really got to commend the ISO for kicking off a process and looking to go to the Board of Governors by May. One thing we want to highlight though, and this was definitely mentioned by Susan Pope yesterday, for those of you that listen to the WEM board meeting, this is a very complicated topic. If we're going to have a long-lasting solution for congestion revenue in EDAM, it's going to take significant work beyond what is seen as a transitional change that's being proposed right now by the California ISO. So we as a sector do not want a decision by the board in May to happen and then to have that be put on the sidelines until after EDAM launch, until we gather data, and then we have 3 years down the road we do this. We would rather have discussions about this topic start pretty much as we're getting ready to launch EDAM to say, what do we need to do? What data do we need to gather in order to develop that process? So after EDAM launches, we can now have that data, put it into the framework, develop that last. Other items on here, similar sorts of items. And John Rumble had mentioned a key focus for his sector is to focus on let's get EDAM launched. All of these items have been discussed by the California ISO for sure in developing EDAM with the thought of these are important, let's get EDAM launched, we'll gather data, do more on these topics. Much like the congestion topic, we think all of these items should not be delayed until after EDAM launch. More discussion, again, establishing a framework, being sure we have a good feel for where we want to go, especially with students, so that once EDAM launches, we're ready to be active in solving these problems. Energy storage, again, commend the California ISO for launching the storage initiative. The long duration storage of the transmission asset is very important to the energy storage sector of the IPP group. It's something that was submitted last year, and the California ISO said, good idea, need to have some more discussions with the local regulatory authorities and the TPP group. So please resubmit for 2025 since these items do not carry over. So we do want it to continue to be something that in the TPP process is going to be considered. The other two items in energy storage, bid cost recovery reform, as well as co-located resource ancillary dispatch. We're not entirely sure if these items fit very well within the current storage initiative. If so, great. If not, maybe it needs a different track or other consideration. So something to just think about as opposed to maybe needing a new initiative. The last item, grid enhancing technologies. As I said at the outset, the ISO we think is doing a very good job at looking at all of these items. If you look at the 24-25 TPP plan that just came out, there was specific focus on what the ISO is doing on grid enhancing technologies, specifically for things like advanced conductoring. But it's done largely on a case-by-case basis. And what we would like as a sector, there to be a bit more focus, a bit more structure and consideration of grid enhancing technology within the TPP can then be adapted and also comply with some of the requirements of SB 10s. Next slide, please. The last item, and this is kind of a general item, we did have one of our members highlight concern about transparency. And while, again, we think the ISO is doing a great job with the stakeholder process, some of the technical items are really, really technical. And getting additional data on some of the items, as you can see, some examples that we have listed here, is important in some of the initiatives to really dig down into what's going on, what decisions are being made, so that stakeholders can see how this information is being used and perhaps use some of that information themselves when developing policy. I think that's it for our sector.
Thanks, guys. From here, we've got the public interest and consumer advocates up next. They've got kind of separated out two different elements or components to this. So I'm going to maybe introduce them both now, but start off with the public interest subsector presentation.
Thank you, Josh. With this down here with WRA. I represent the public interest sector, and technically today clocks 4 or 5 years of being in this role. First of all, congratulations to Madam Chair Allison and Madam Vice Chair Lindsay. And the PR sector is very appreciative of being able to partner with all the sectors in presenting our thoughts. I go straight to any improvements or process issues so far. We don't have any, not because we didn't find any, it's because we believe in the same three principles that the PIO sector strongly believes in. We believe in a robust, transparent, and liquid market. We want any market that has been set up, especially EDAM, which is one of its kind, as an improvement and enhancement of the EIM, to be able to share the impact and effectiveness. So I agree with my colleagues in asking, let's get the liftoff of May 2026 happen, and then go back and improve things rather than keep changing the foundations of the building that you're trying to build. So that'll be my request on behalf of the PIOs, who actually are very stressed in many places, but once in a while different PIO entities will come up and respond or share ideas or feedback. And unfortunately, sometimes they are so sensitive about not attributing to them that I'm speaking on behalf of some of them with some of the thoughts on areas to sustain. One other thing about the PIO subsector that's unfortunately not well appreciated is we are technology and fuel agnostic. We want the market to work well, and hopefully market and price discovery will yield the best and biggest benefits. Moving on to areas we would like to sustain.
Tell them the next slide.
Oh, next slide, please. Thank you, John. The 2 slides out. Yes, I should be looking at the screen there. One more slide, please. Thank you. Yes, perfect. We came up with this logic called sustain or maintain momentum. And I think you'll see a lot of similarity with my colleagues. So I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole here to repeat things, but we do see 2 areas that CalISO has an opportunity to help. One is really complete the work around the long-term duration storage from a transmission asset perspective. That's going to become a lot more relevant with co-location and all the concerns and projections flying all over the skies from different load growth projections of different utilities, but also the greenhouse gas initiative with a little more closer emphasis on reporting, because after all, ideally, the PIOs have always wanted one West-wide market. So consistent and more robust reporting would be valuable to raise the game. Next slide, please. In terms of new initiatives and priorities, thank you. We really came down to 2 after caucusing, and in fact, some of the PIO representatives include think tanks and some NGOs who partner with member groups in the IPP sector. And the first is a SEAMS framework. And I'm unfortunately pleased to say that WRA filed a motion in the SPP. Mark is present. I see Chair Laura there, she would agree, to propose the SEAMS framework last year in the SPP framework. So we asked the same year, and lo and behold, we found that you had 2 entities that have supported the same motion last year. So we're just reinforcing the recommendation for the EDAM to initiate a conversation to identify a SEAMS framework, which will have the fundamental components, and to what was said by Lauren, and I will touch upon that when the panel starts about SEAMS, is they're really identifying the economic aspects of SEAMS and where you think efficiencies may lie and where you think inefficiencies could happen. The second is there's a lot of interest. I'm dealing with at WRA. We are engaged in 6 states. 3 or 4 of the 6 states have legislations in play for grid enhancing technologies. That's a wonderful thing. Technology innovation is great, but our concern is the focus, if CalISO staff looks at grid enhancing technologies, only from the eye focus on efficiencies, rather than we would like it to not be considered as an alternative or a condition to new transmission build out. So I hope the CalISO transmission planning process does not take GTs as a necessary minimum condition to new transmission planning. That's an area that PIOs feel strongly about. And in terms of high priority issues, we re-emphasize SEAMS given the potential bifurcated market structure that we may see in the West. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think that is it for me. And we can give it to us, co-subsector consumer advocates for their perspective as well. Thank you. I don't know if Jamie is covering the consumer advocates.
Yeah, I'm here, Jay. Next slide, please. Hi, I'm Jamie Stamington. I am with the Montana Consumer Council, and I am the Consumer Advocate Subsector RIF Liaison. Next slide, please. Well, we have no feedback regarding the 2025 process that described in the January 30th meeting. Hopefully that's a good thing. Like Vijay's subsector, we often are kind of stretched thin. So that might be part of it, or maybe also part of it, just things are going well and there's no feedback due to that. So hopefully it's the latter. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the current roadmap priorities that came out of the 2024 plan process, and reliability, demand response resources, minimum on times, and fixed cost dispatch was submitted by the California Large Energy Consumer Association, and that was due to the fact that participating customers incur fixed costs associated with curtailment and startup per dispatch event rather than based on the event duration. And they also wanted to reflect minimum on times greater than 1 hour to more accurately reflect the run times in CAISO's market optimization and dispatch. This initiative was accepted by the ISO and is being considered within the upcoming initiative. And so they're starting a new DER policy initiative this first quarter of this year. So they're going to begin with scoping demand flexibility working groups, and current DER products will be considered within the scoping working groups. And this topic should be proposed for further discussion in this venue. Next slide, please. This initiative was regarding to add scheduling initiative clause to the approved project sponsor agreement. This was submitted by the Cal Advocates, and it's being considered a process improvement by the ISO. And this is really related to the process developed and established through FERC Order 1000 compliance efforts, and with regard to FERC Order specifically, and with regard to FERC Order 1920, which proposes broad changes to the transmission planning process. So the ISO is going to need to consider how to best move forward with this proposal in regard to its 1920 compliance efforts. Next slide, please. And adding enforcement of cost containment terms to the APSA. It's also considered a process improvement by the ISO. Again, this was submitted by Cal Advocates, and it's similar to what I discussed earlier. It's related to FERC Order 1920, and so they're going to have to consider how to best respond to this proposal in the future. Next slide, please. Another one was allowing competitive bidding on transmission products over 100 kV. And the ISO considers this a non-catalog item. And again, it's related to the other two I just discussed regarding FERC Order 1920 compliance efforts. Next slide, please. As for new initiatives in this roadmap process, there were none submitted by my subsector. So hopefully that's a good sign. Next slide, please. And as for other high priority issues, one that particularly I think, and I'm focusing on my subsector, and as we've seen the other sectors involved, is the SEAMS issue. Markets Plus is being developed. All the market participants are choosing who they're going to go join. And so these SEAMS issues, both the positives and the negatives, are going to have to be evaluated and dealt with in the future. And I'm glad that we are focusing on SEAMS, and we have devoted a portion of this meeting to SEAMS because it's a very important issue. And thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Vijay. I think we have the PMAs next. There we go. Yep. PMAs.
All right, great. Thank you. This is Allie Mace of Bonneville Power Administration and the liaison for the Power Marketing Administration sector. So let's go to the next slide. So from the PMA sector, we just had some feedback on the policy initiatives process. First of all, we do really appreciate the opportunity for this stakeholder-driven policy initiative proposals and the opportunity to present those and discuss those. Really appreciate that process that the CAISO staff has set up. The annual process, I know it's discussion of whether annual is the right timing. We do feel like it is helpful to have the annual process because sometimes there are these time critical issues that we see pop up each year, and there may not be a lot of new initiatives that are brought forward, but it is helpful from the PMA's perspective to have this opportunity to bring those new initiatives forward or to use this as a venue to talk about some of the newer high priority issues. Just one recommendation for improvement from the sector is to consider adding a step for stakeholder review and comment on the draft or the final roadmap prior to presenting that to the governing body. So there's a chance to provide feedback on that last roadmap after it's developed. Let's go to the next slide. For current policy initiatives roadmap, we do have a number of priorities and rank them as high priority and medium priority from the PMA's perspective. Two broad initiatives that are high priority. One is the price formation enhancements and continuing work in both in the scarcity pricing and market power mitigation, as well as in fast start pricing and moving those initiatives forward. And the other is the greenhouse gas coordination work. And all aspects of that are important to our sector to advance those and bring them forward to conclusion. And then in medium priority, we would still like to see the resource efficiency evaluation enhancements, phase 3 kicked off and moving forward. We know there are a number of items from phase 2 that were flagged for follow-up in phase 3 that we look forward to working on. So let's go to the next slide for new initiative priorities. So I think I'm going to sound a lot like my colleague Scott on one of these here. So for high priority initiatives, we did talk about within EDAM, particularly the congestion revenue allocation enhancements, understanding that it is now underway. But I'd echo some of what Scott shared, that has been presented as the current proposal is a transition and is not the longer term solution, in that we really want to make sure that there's time set aside on the roadmap and staff time dedicated to support that longer term initiative and to continue that work on congestion revenue allocation. Rather than waiting, we know that roadmap does get pretty busy and there's a lot of initiatives and limited staff time. So we suggest prioritizing that to ensure that that work continues and is supported. We also supported kind of related the EDAM enhancements overarching initiative suggestion that was submitted by WPTF that did include the congestion revenue allocation, also included the economic intertie bidding in the EDAM, which is another important topic to the sector. Within the WEIM, our sector did submit a initiative around settlements enhancements and looking at some of the elements of how settlements are handled in the EIM and having an opportunity to look into some of those and explore some improvements in those areas. And then echoing what others have said, internal and external market seams issues are critically important, and we're glad we'll be talking about those later today at this meeting. And then for medium priority, we were really interested in the flexible renting product enhancements. There's interest in the element of that around looking at the data, with that being with some new enhancements in that area and evaluating how that's working and understanding that. So going on to the next slide, just my last slide here. In terms of other high priority issues, there was an ongoing transparency effort that was recommended in one policy initiative. We didn't think about this as a discrete initiative, but it seemed in discussions more like this could be like an enhancement to the CAISO stakeholder process, where some of this data sharing is integrated on a regular basis through different initiatives and processes that already exist. And we were thinking, as the launch of EDAM is coming up, data accessibility and this continued ability to look at and learn from what's happening continues to increase in importance. And that wraps up the input from the PMAs, and I believe it goes to Vijay next for the EDAM sector.
So that's right. And then John is going to take us home. So I'm going to conclude my portion. But EDAM sector head, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. This is BJ Singh from Pacific Core, representing the EDAM sector. Next slide, please. So on feedback for this year's roadmap process for our sector, prioritization is of particular interest. Specifically, the EDAM sector would like to better understand how the CAISO uses feedback from the prioritization survey. And we think it would be helpful to see some sort of hierarchy of proposals based on the prioritization surveys from stakeholders. I think the main question we were kind of curious to hear more about was how we can use the prioritization process to help ensure that stakeholders can fully participate in all of the initiatives that make it through the process. And just in general, I think our sector really prioritizes the quality of market design changes, the quantity of changes that happen in any given year. Next slide, please. For current initiatives in the roadmap, greenhouse gas and the demand response initiatives are high priorities for our sector. On the WEM resource efficiency evaluation enhancements, we generally support extending assistance energy transfers with the current design sunsetting this year. And enhancements are worth exploring, but at this time, the sector probably doesn't have time to take on another full initiative. I know this has been something that other sectors have said as well. On the price formation enhancements, we do also support slowing down this initiative to accommodate the congestion revenue allocation initiative. As the congestion revenue allocation directly affects EDAM, of course. And the one maybe caveat is the market power mitigation track seems to be closest to finding an enhancement. So we do think this one could continue. And then there's also support in the data sector for keeping this storage initiative. Next slide, please. As for new initiatives that were submitted this year on the EDAM enhancements, we support moving quickly for the congestion revenue allocation initiative. And then for any future enhancements, our priority is to focus on critical market function improvements after go live. There will be things that come up that we see need to change quickly. And for any other enhancements, I think our sector is feeling like we need experience from the EDAM before making any large changes. Also, for our sector, I mean, we believe that SEAM's discussion is really important. However, it's difficult to determine now what exactly that initiative we focus on, but I think that will have it. Next slide, please. And then for other high priority issues, really top priority is EDAM implementation at this point. And so, you know, staff sometimes works on policy and implementation, which definitely can create challenges for participating as a full participant in some of the stakeholder initiatives. And I think this just kind of goes along with the themes everyone's doing, especially it. That is it for me.
Okay, thanks, Vijay. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here we invite any stakeholders who may not necessarily be associated with any particular sector represented here today, or if there are any public comments. In the room, please raise your hand, and if you have any additional comments. Online, I believe if you raise your hand, that's a virtual rate. This is a physical, but we want a virtual raised hand online if there are any additional comments. Okay. Nope. Oh, that's
Better.
Good morning, Joanne Serena here with the Cal. So, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about. First of all, well, thank you for welcoming the ISO here. Based. And I just wanted to mention that back on the stakeholder process is much appreciated. And I really do appreciate the fact that stakeholders are coming along on this journey with us. So involving the stakeholder process. So definitely take your feedback and we'll continue to work with you on continuing to solve this. In terms of priorities, definitely hear from stakeholders theme that there's certainly a lot of initiatives on the plate, a lot of heavy workload for all stakeholders, and we really do want to make sure stakeholders can actively participate in initiatives. And so when we did kick off the EDM suggestion revenue allocation, took a look at the schedule and started to make some adjustments. And we do recognize that we need to make some further adjustments. So I think that input from the survey will help guide us in terms of evaluating how we can either slow things down a little bit. So definitely appreciate that feedback and continue to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are there any additional comments? Moderator, are there any virtual hands raised?
Do not have any hands up in the virtual queue at this time.
Okay. That's because we covered everything. So, next slide, please. And one more slide, and I'll be brief here. I think we've have said our pieces very well, and you think there is widespread agreement that the EDM congestion rent allocation is an issue that requires that sort of critical priority, and folks are generally supportive of moving forward expeditiously. And you know, some entities have obviously expressed an interest that it moves beyond just consideration of a transitional solution, and hopefully that it will move into a more permanent solution, and that should probably be the next step. I think there's a relatively broad agreement on that. Additionally, I think folks have a lot of uncertainty, which is why about how EDM is going to move forward in potentially 2 markets west, and which is why folks are very interested in seeing intertie bidding. How is this all going to work? You know, we're chomping at the bit, but you know, as some folks have said as well, you can't really address the unknown, and you're going to need to you know, actually move forward with EDAM to be able to effervesce any issues that maybe haven't forethought. And then lastly, I think as we've talked about, it just is probably a sign that there were very few initiatives submitted, new initiatives submitted last year. There were lots of new initiatives submitted, and we didn't have enough time to talk about it at the meeting. This year we've got a little more time, and that in itself may be indicative that from the broader group that the right amount is being addressed, or maybe too much is being addressed, and you know we've talked about that a fair amount. I will pause there, and I believe we have somebody from the BOSER who might be providing some comments as well. And you need a microphone. May I introduce Lisa Tawney, our Oregon PUC member here today?
Thanks so much for having me. Since you're in Portland, welcome to Portland. It's the great state of Oregon. if the RIF's coming to town, I don't want to miss it. But I really have appreciated this conversation, and seeing the RIF process mature over the years has been a real privilege. So I know how much work that takes by the RIF liaisons to work with your sectors. The BOSSer similarly does a lot of coordination and evaluation work. I know how much time it takes away from your other job duties, and really appreciate the thoughtful comments that I'm hearing this morning, weighing the importance of the improvements with the actual resource capacity in the region, and some really critical procedural justice issues around who can be at which meetings. So I've really appreciated the conversation I've heard this morning. The BOSSer continues to engage through our venues, and it's just been a delight to see the maturation of the stakeholder process, both in the CAISO staff's adaptation in real time to feedback, but also in the stakeholders really stepping up. So welcome to Portland, and thanks for letting me crash the RIF meeting and listen to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. I think then. Oh, and we also have a governing board member here, Rebecca Wagner, and I'm sorry, I was not informed of your mic in your hand. Thank you very much.
Governing body, either in person or on the phone. And with us is Joe Etto from the Board of Governors. I hope that demonstrates that we take seriously what you're doing. And I found the presentation really helpful. You succinctly narrowed it down. It was interesting to see the differences and then some of the themes. So thank you. This is when we were on the transitional committee, this is what we envisioned that the RIF would evolve to. So congratulations on that. Congratulations to the new slate of leadership for RIF, and thank you, Meg, for all of your hard work. And I'll stop there so we can move it along.
Great, thank you very much. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so should you have any further questions or comments, please reach out and either to your sector liaisons or me, to anybody here on the RIF, and we will be preparing a report in the coming weeks, maybe months, days. I'm not sure. Weeks. Okay, thank you. And it'll be maybe a little thinner than last year's, but we intend to sort of flesh out what we've talked about today, and be able to provide that sort of and clear input that hopefully will help continue the process moving along. Okay, should we transition?
All right, I'll do it. We're going to move to our next topic, but I think before we do that, we should take a quick 5-minute break. We're running more or less on schedule, so why don't we all come back in about 5 minutes and we'll get started on the RIF enhancements project.
And there's coffee and some snacks
Yes.
in the hall behind outside the doors if you haven't found those already.
All right. Is this better in terms of being able to hear toward the back? Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So we're going to get started here on the discussion about the RIF enhancements project. And if we can go to the next slide. We have a number of liaisons who are going to be covering different aspects of this today. I'll start out with just an overview and then talk a little bit about the transition process. Rahul will cover some of the potential enhancements related to the policy initiative identification and prioritization process. Ali and BJ will cover the stakeholder initiative, and Ali will cover indicative voting. Mary will round things out with a broad discussion about the function and purpose of RIF, and then we'll have some time for Q&A.
If we can go to the next slide. And the next slide. So just as a little bit of background, I won't cover this in too much detail, but the West-wide Governance Pathways Initiative Step 2 final proposal was issued late last year. And it includes obviously a very comprehensive set of changes that will involve reforming the governance of the Western energy markets to place it under a regional organization or RO. Within the Step 2 final proposal, there is discussion of changes to the stakeholder process. In some ways, the stakeholder process under the final proposal looks similar to the current CAISO process. Is this the right? Okay. Okay. Keep me posted on how the mic is working. Part of the stakeholder process reforms include changes to establish a stakeholder representatives committee, which is in some ways analogous to the regional issues forum. The stakeholder representatives committee has a somewhat expanded role relative to the RIF, and the idea is to facilitate a more stakeholder-driven stakeholder process. And the SRC's purpose will be to enhance and coordinate the role of stakeholders within our stakeholder proceedings. Obviously, legislation is needed to fully implement the Step 2 final proposal, but there are elements of the final proposal related to the stakeholder process and specifically related to the SRC that the RIF thinks could be implemented in the absence of any legislation. And even if legislation doesn't come to pass, there are beneficial improvements included in the final proposal that we think we should consider now. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at as part of this project is how we can efficiently transition the RIF into the Stakeholder Representatives Committee, again, assuming that the pathways legislation moves forward, the RO is formed. A key part of that involves transitioning the sectors, because as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the sectors under the RIF are different than the sectors under the Step 2 final proposal. And then finally, we'd like to consider how to include elements of the Step 2 final proposal related to the stakeholder process within the framework of what the RIF is or could be doing. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the timing for this effort, we published a discussion paper, and that is posted on the RIF page of the Western Energy Markets website. We're here and we're going to provide an overview of the paper today. And then in the next roughly 6 weeks, the RIF sector liaisons will be conducting some sector outreach, and we'll also have a public stakeholder comment period. There is a comments template that's posted that identifies some topics that we're specifically interested in receiving feedback on. And so we'd encourage the RIF community to consider submitting comments into our process. We'll take that input from the RIF community and then develop an updated proposal with some next steps. Next slide, please. In terms of the criteria for considering changes to the RIF, this is detailed with more specificity in the discussion paper, but we're trying to look at areas of enhancements that kind of fall into the category of being no regrets changes, things that we would do irrespective of whether or not the pathways moves forward. And we're also trying to make sure that we are limiting our efforts to items that don't require extensive changes to, for example, the RIF-related elements of the Western Energy Markets Charter, We don't want to burden CAISO staff with an extensive set of changes that may or may not be in alignment with where staff is headed as far as its stakeholder process reforms. And we want to be cognizant of workload, both on the RIF liaisons and to the stakeholder community in terms of integrating more elements of stakeholder-driven process within the stakeholder initiative and the RIF. And we want to make sure that where the liaisons think this effort is headed is consistent with where stakeholders would like to see it go. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So just to some extent, this is a bit of a recap of what I just mentioned, but we are proposing to actually transition the RIF into the SRC under the RO framework. An alternative approach might be to create the Stakeholder Representatives Committee as a standalone body and kind of stand up a new entity or organization. And I think among the liaisons, there's consensus that this would not be an efficient approach and that we think it would be much preferred to leverage the experience and the structures of the RIF that we have in place now to actually evolve the RIF into this new structure. As we look to implement a transition, develop and implement a transition process, we want to make sure that we're not getting ahead of the steps within the pathways framework. So we wouldn't actually propose to do anything formal in terms of becoming the SRC, obviously, until the predicates that are contemplated under the pathways process are met. So that would be legislation and findings that certain criteria, findings by the CAISO Board of Governors that certain criteria have been established to actually move forward and implement the broader proposal that Pathways has developed. And so the SRC would kind of follow that. But we're looking at different components that the RIF could be doing and how we can support that transition so that the stakeholder body is ready if and when Pathways comes to pass. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So a key component of the SRC that will be different under the SRC structure involves the composition of the different sectors. Currently, the RIF sectors are listed in the Western Energy Markets Charter, and they generally, with a couple of exceptions, mainly the PMA sector and the EDM entity sector at this time. There's 2 representatives for each of the sectors. Next slide, please. Under the step 2 final proposal, there's actually a fair amount of overlap with some sectors, but there are some key differences. And if we can go to the next slide, I think we summarize some of those. So there will be, under the SRC structure, 2 new sectors, one for the large commercial and industrial customers and one sector for entities that represent distributed energy resource interests. And there are some changes to the composition of several existing sectors. For example, under the CAISO, in the current framework, the CAISO PTO sector includes some independent transmission developers that are PTOs. Those entities, as we've been interpreting the step 2 final proposal, will be moving into the IPPM sector. Demand response providers, as noted, will be moving into the new distributed energy resources sector. The PIO and consumer advocate sector, which are currently joined as one sector, will be formally separated. We've talked among the liaisons about the integration of community choice aggregators. Currently, we've opted to include those entities in the consumer and utilities sector to ensure that they have a forum for participation, but under the step 2 final proposal, there's a non-IOU LSE sector that would be where they fit. And finally, the PMA sector would be moving into either the WEM or EDM entity sector as opposed to being standalone. Next slide, please. So the proposal that we've outlined in the discussion paper is really to develop a process to transition the sectors of the RIF into the sectors of the SRC. And there's going to be a period of time where we don't actually formally implement the SRC structure. What we propose to do instead for this transitional period is to create the new sectors and start creating a roster of organizations that are participating in the RIF and that will participate in the SRC, and maintain kind of two parallel lists of sector participants for a period of time, so that we have an idea of who's in the RIF currently and who's going to be in the SRC. And the reason for this kind of dual maintenance of a dual list is driven by a timing consideration, which is that we've heard from the Pathways team that at this time they would like to begin thinking about how to form the sectors that are needed under the SRC structure. And the reason for that is that they're hoping to begin the nominating committee process toward the end of this year at the earliest. And so it would be optimal for the new sector structure to be identified and organized, and particularly for those new sectors to be able to start functioning as a sector in order to support the nominating committee process for formation of the RO board. And again, we've heard that the earliest this may be is later this year. So if we're going to support that as the RIF, we need to start that process now. Obviously, these are areas where the liaisons are very interested in stakeholder feedback on what that transition process and the timing might be. So if the broader RIF community has thoughts on how we might approach this, or ideas for how we can develop this transition process, we'd ask that those be included in comments. And I will stop there. I think we have Raul taking over next. And if we can go to the next slide.
I'm hoping I get the mic.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
So, moving on to the policy initiative identification and prioritization, we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so under the step 2 of the final proposal, the policy identification process and prioritization is very similar to the current CASA process. There's going to be a policy initiative catalog and a roadmap, and a roundtable discussion of stakeholders and sector priorities. Some of the key enhancements from the current process is the SRC will be collaborating with the RO to prioritize the initiatives for the roadmap. What's envisioned is the SRC will be, members of SRC will be very active in, working through the stakeholder process and work hand in hand with the RO staff. There will also be an indicative voting for the catalog roadmap, which is very similar to the survey that we currently do. It will just fall under a different umbrella of, there will be voting, and envision that the voting results would be transparent and presented based on sectors. RO would inform SRC of the prioritization needs. And this is similar to what happens now, that you have initiatives proposed by different sector members, but CAISO has to come back and evaluate the needs. It will be very similar under the new implementation, where RO will inform SRC of the prioritization. So we are basically proposing to maintain and build on existing process for the catalog, roadmap, and roundtable. And the idea is, we are seeking feedback from everybody on this transition process. So I think that's my end, and we'll hand it back to
Ali and
goes to VJ, actually.
VJ.
I'm passing it down.
You guys can share a mic.
Next slide, please. Go to the next slide. And one more. Okay, so the step 2 final proposal envisions an expanded role for the SRC in the issue evaluation, problem statement, and policy development phases of the stakeholder process. The current process does not include a formal role for the RIP. And so changes under the step 2 final proposal include the sector sponsor role and increased use of smaller working groups and advisory or indicative voting. Next slide, please. Okay, so on sector sponsors, the idea would to have somebody partner with the CAISO to identify issues, create problem statements, and develop policy solutions. This person would engage at key points throughout the stakeholder initiative. Sponsors would not need to be a RIF liaison or SRC representative. The sponsor should have an understanding of issues and interests in facilitating the stakeholder engagement, but not need to be a technical expert. The sponsor role also is not intended to be an avenue for stakeholders' position, really just to help facilitate and engage. Again, purpose, facilitate engagement among stakeholders and assist with outreach between stakeholders and the CAISO staff. And then also to help ensure the initiative is progressing in a constructive manner, that stakeholder voices, both majority and minority, are being considered, and the sponsor would help facilitate substantive discussions among stakeholders with different perspectives. Next slide, please. On work groups, the smaller groups of stakeholders could be convened to help identify issues and problem statements and work through any technical or complex issues, and then finally help shape any policy development. The idea here would be that work groups would be formed after collaboration between the sector sponsors and the CAISO or RO staff, where they determine that smaller work groups would be beneficial. And the work groups would be expected to provide the results of work and proposals back to the larger stakeholder community to ensure that there is appropriate transparency. I'm going to pass it back to Ali now.
Great, thank you. Let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about what the RIP is specifically proposing within those 2 areas that BJ just talked about. So for the sector sponsorship topic, we're proposing that beginning with the 2025 roadmap, RIF liaisons would self-nominate or could nominate other sector members to act as a sponsor of initiatives. We're thinking if multiple stakeholders express interest, the RIF could hold a discussion and determine the best path forward. We want to be sure that it's an opportunity that's open, and maybe could include joint sponsorship if there were multiple folks interested in it. But trying to support that transition to people serving as a sponsor and partnering with the CAISO staff and helping to support stakeholder engagement in the initiatives. And we do note the sponsoring stakeholder would not necessarily need to be a technical expert, because of course that's not what they would be bringing, would be necessarily the technical expertise, but should have a strong interest in supporting stakeholder engagement and working across the sectors to support that engagement. In the work groups, we are recommending that the sponsor would help establish and manage these as one element of stakeholder engagement. They'd partner with the ISS staff to define these and to recruit members, and could assist the staff with presenting the results of those work groups back to the broader stakeholder initiative for review and feedback. And that's been an important element about talking about the work groups, is making sure that if you have a small group that's going and working separately, that there's transparency and parts of their work are going back to the broader initiative. And then the focus on that is something discrete, right? It's not the whole policy initiative, it's a discrete technical task or a policy element that the work group is addressing. So let's go on to the next topic, which is related very closely to the stakeholder initiative, but a little different, and that's the indicative voting. So let's go to the next slide and then one more slide. So in the step 2 final proposal, it included indicative voting throughout the stakeholder process. And in that proposal, it envisioned really a comprehensive voting where there was really a process set up to support that, and a registration process, and a pretty comprehensive approach to it. And in that context, the SRC was reviewing results of the votes and reporting each sector's position.
In thinking about this, we looked at the fact that CAISO has used indicative position statements in stakeholder initiatives in the past. That has come in often through the comment template. And our proposal is to resume the use of indicative voting through those position statements by stakeholders during comment periods. So it's a request of the ISO to begin implementing basic indicative voting. And what that would look like is inclusion of a question in the stakeholder comment template along the lines of this. Please provide a one-word reply to indicate whether your organization supports, opposes, or holds a neutral position with respect to the relevant issue, paper, or proposal element. And that was actually lifted directly from the ISO's process around the Pathways Step 1 proposal. And this would represent an incremental step towards that more comprehensive indicative voting approach. In the Step 2 proposal, it kind of reintroduces the concept of voting to the stakeholders, starts to transition towards that. From the RIF perspective, it would provide us on where our sector members stand on initiatives and issues, and help inform the RIF when we're reporting stakeholder and sector positions to the governing body or others through our comments and discussion. With that, I'm going to pass this over to Mary to talk about the function and purpose of the RIF.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the function and purpose of the RIF and kind of thinking through the evolution of the RIF as it transitions to the SRC, as the SRC was characterized and defined in the Pathways. So go ahead to the next slide. So historically, the RIF has really focused on educational and informational content and discussion. It's really been a space for dialogue among and between stakeholders and ISO staff. This has already evolved over time. The RIF has evolved to include consideration of issues and pending stakeholder initiatives. And for those of you who have been around for as long as I have, that was the case initially. The RIF actually talked about ongoing initiatives and involvement in the and the RIF was not involved in the initiative identification and prioritization. So the RIF has already actually gone through a number of iterations over history, and the transition or the evolution into the SRC is a really continuation of how the RIF has been evolving since it first came into being. And so really what we're thinking through here as far as that transition is looking for the RIF to be able to assign sub-teams of subject matter experts to evaluate proposals and report on recommendations for solutions. So really kind of a more substantive and technical role, potentially for the RIF to contribute to stakeholder processes, produce documents and opinions for the WEM governing body or the CAISO. Again, kind of really trying to input into the process at the CAISO staff level as well as the governing body level. And then communicate RIF-related information and or perspectives directly to the governing body or the CAISO. So I think what we're really talking about here is a little bit more of a direct connection and communication from the RIF on a substantive basis to the governing body and the CAISO to enhance transparency and make sure that there's really that information being communicated in a transparent. And then go to the next slide. So expanding on that a little bit, the Step 2 final proposal really emphasizes the role of the SRC as providing that advice and input, really in direct connection with the stakeholder process, and facilitating and supporting stakeholder participation both individually and in sectors. And really thinking of the SRC more as, a clearinghouse for developing advice and input and stimulating dialogue among stakeholders on substantive issues. The Pathways proposal also reiterates that the SRC representatives should be committed to supporting and facilitating the participation of the stakeholder community in the stakeholder process. And even if in a particular stakeholder's perspective or position is not aligned with the position of the SRC representative or the SRC representatives. So I think here it's not trying to, the pathways proposal really gives the opportunity for individual entities to continue to engage and voice their own particular and unique perspective. But we also want to have a better sense of what is sort of the vibe of the stakeholder community and each sector as well. So that's what this is trying to do. Go to the next slide. The step 2 final proposal also establishes an expectation of regular SRC reporting to the RO board. This is existing authority actually under the RIP, but it's really only exercised episodically, and it's been challenging. And by the way, I should have probably mentioned this before I started speaking. I'm actually not a RIF liaison. So some of you may be wondering what I'm speaking about, but starting last year, the end of last year. And so I was filling in for her as her proxy while this all kind of started and went on. So in the future, you'll see more. I'm not here talking about this, but that's me. So what I understand from the RIF liaisons is that it's been somewhat challenging to sort of process around, getting that kind of reporting into the board or into the governing body, really kind of being able to like dedicate time to writing, positions and putting documents together and things like that. It's a challenging and time consuming. And so I think that the process has been a little bit ad hoc. But the SRC, I think it's really envisioned as having more of a robust process around that and the ability to increase that reporting on pending issues directly to the RO board. So the RIP proposal here is to expand its involvement in the stakeholder process consistent with the discussion paper. As we already talked about, the sector sponsor role, working groups, and helping to facilitate stakeholder participation and consensus building. And really try to think through the undertaking of that increased reporting to the governing body and what that looks like and what the process is to kind of enhance the frequency of that and develop a more standard process for it versus kind of the ad hoc approach that's been taken thus far. And then eventually transition away from just the informational educational content. Given that under the pathways framework, that the informational and educational content is envisioned to be handled by the Office of Public Participation. And would no longer really be the assignment of the SRC or the RIF to perform that role. Go to the next slide. Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, so now we're going to open up for questions and discussion. Before we do that, I just want to make one note in that RIF is really looking for feedback on our proposal. This is our vision of how the RIF can transition to be more closely functioning to the pathways proposal. But we really do want stakeholder feedback here to help inform our proposal and kind of how we. So maybe let's start with questions in the room, and I can walk the mic around. Okay, it doesn't look like there's anything in the room.
People in the back.
Thanks for the presentation. I think it's very helpful. Prior to today's presentation, I spent a little bit of time working with Meg and Allie about that transition. So certainly very, very supportive of what you outlined, and our Aaron sort of essentially take some next steps in helping to make this a reality. And so I'm looking right now at indicative voting, reintroducing that concept as we have in the past. And getting that underway. So appreciate the partnership and working with all of you on rolling that out and making sure we're in line with where you want to go in terms of. Becky, if there's any additional comments? Sure, thanks, Joanne. Becky Robinson with the ISO. I just really wanted to express appreciation for the taking on this role, proactively thinking about enhancements. And just from my personal perspective, some of you may know in a prior role of mine, I had the opportunity to work as a company that participated in the stakeholder process. And so on a personal level, I think it is very powerful when stakeholders can speak for themselves and also can speak for a group of stakeholders. And I think I appreciate that as a new challenge in some ways for folks in the but I think that's, I'm very encouraged by what's here. I think it is, I'll be very excited to see what are the comments and the sense of the stakeholder community in moving in this direction and taking on these responsibilities. And I will say as well, the director of the market policy team at the ISO, my team is really interested to kind of see where this goes. And we had a lot of conversations about it, and I think it's something that we are very open to, and I think will be a very interesting opportunity in terms of moving forward and enhancing sort of stakeholder engagement in our policy development. So I really appreciate
The bulky something from the public generating pool. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more if this was part of the thought process around where what the forum is for the ongoing education piece with the Office of Education. Is that within the discrete stakeholder processes, or is that in some other new forum that is works in some way with the SRC, or is that not part of the proposal? Sort of the recognizing that we're moving away from that piece of the RIF here, but that's been, I think, a valuable part of the RIF forum for many participants. Where does that fit, or how do we maintain that in the transition here?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I can touch on that, and I'll try and talk loud so that I don't make everyone's ears hurt with the microphone. Oh, it's back. Okay, so under the step 2 final proposal, and I'm characterizing pathways here. So my understanding is that function is transitioning to the Office of Public Participation, which will be a separate entity or structure than the SRC. For the transition period, and this is for the period where, you know, the RIF is kind of moving to the SRC, I think what we will probably do is maintain some of that educational and informational focus during our meetings. Like, for example, we're about to have a broad discussion on market seams. I think we'll keep that function as we transition the role of the RIF into the SRC, but you might see some evolution in the level of depth or maybe the quantity of that type of content as we pivot to more stakeholder process focused conversations. With that said, I think this is an area where it'd be great to get some stakeholder feedback. So if you have thoughts or ideas for how that transition should happen and what you would like to see, this is certainly an area that's ripe for comment.
Okay, any other questions in the room?
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Sponsorship. I know Kaiso have been doing some already. The sponsorship idea, and I would just be curious. I know that was a little bit awkward at first, so I'd be curious to learn more as a stakeholder group to kind of learn more about what that sponsorship role includes. And I'm sorry, I should have said Jessica's not on PSNX. But what that sponsorship role includes and what the responsibilities are. So kind of having some more clarity and structure around that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that a little bit more. I think, since we're not doing it yet, it obviously can evolve over time, the sponsorship role, but our initial thoughts are that this sponsor will really help kind of bridge the gap between the stakeholder community and the CAISO, and really just help facilitate and make sure that majority and minority views are being expressed and passed along to the CAISO. So that's kind of our initial thoughts there. I don't know, Allie, do you want to?
Is it okay if I ask? And I don't know that this is reflected in the proposal, but I think the principle is there. But I also think there's a role, there's an element of transparency on that I think the sponsor hopefully can bring as well, in terms of what are the areas of tension between stakeholders and what are the trade-offs that are being considered within the stakeholder process, and sort of articulating those and making them more transparent for entities participating in the process to understand what those kind of tensions and I don't want to say as strong as like points of disagreement, but areas where there are trade-offs that are being made, and trying to have that more clearly articulated and be something that stakeholders can directly discuss in a transparent way.
Oh, you have one there too? No, we want you to speak.
We have a second microphone too.
Oh, is there anything on the phone?
Yeah. Any other questions in the room and before we go to?
We do have one hand up online whenever you're ready to take it.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
All right, Catherine Stockton, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This is Catherine Stockton from the Energy Division. I'm thinking about the indicative voting, and I really like the concept, but I'm wondering if you have considered any kind of more nuanced voting. Like I feel like a lot of entities would have a hard time saying support or oppose with no conditions. So I'm thinking like something like support as is, support with minor revisions, support with major revisions, neutral, oppose unless major revisions, or oppose as written. Or then like another one could be that you see like on surveys a lot, strongly support, somewhat support, neutral, somewhat opposed, strongly opposed. So I'm just thinking, I think for the CPC, we might have a hard time, strongly opposing things, but then we would also have a hard time supporting things because we, see the need for certain changes to protect ratepayers.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you for that feedback. I think that's helpful feedback and thinking about the indicative voting. I think one of the things that is helpful about the way it would be structured, at least in this transition period, would be that it would be as part of the comment period, as well as part of the comment template as well. So that gives a really good opportunity for stakeholders who are responding to provide their indicative vote, and then throughout the comment to provide more of the thinking behind that, or for example, like you suggested, the revisions that would get them to a support from a neutral or from an opposed. So I think that's helpful feedback, and I appreciate that thought as we think about it. I think I want to add something too.
I would just add that if you take a look at the comments template that we actually included with our discussion paper, I think we have a support with caveats, and oppose. and oppose with caveats. And I think that is either the same or similar to the framework that the ISO had utilized at one point, so that you could kind of express a nuance between wholeheartedly supporting or opposing a topic or an initiative, and maybe indicating a more, as I said, nuanced position whereby you're generally supportive, but there are additional elements you'd like to see, or you're opposed, but if one or two things changed, you would maybe alter your position. So I think at this point, from at least the RIF's perspective, I think we're interested in hearing stakeholder feedback on what type of approach and structure you think would be best suited for trying to capture the range of stakeholder positions on an item, because what we're interested in is receiving information that will allow us to properly characterize the positions of members of our sectors on a particular topic. And so if there's a refinement to the voting rubric, I think that's something that would be good to hear from stakeholders on.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I think you're absolutely right. We do have some flexibility in terms of how we label those positions. And I do think sort of those medium positions where it's based on caveats or opposed with caveats is a little bit more helpful than neutral. Through sort of experience that a lot of times neutral is the only other option between support and oppose. Tend to get a lot of neutrals, and that's not necessarily helpful. So I do think we can sort of strike the right balance and have those sort of in between positions that for that feedback, and open to other feedback as well. Just have some ideas on how we would want to label those positions.
Oh, this is Lauren Charlize with the Energy Authority. I do think it would be helpful to have an option if someone maybe is undecided or needs more information, something that allows a stakeholder to say they're not quite ready to put their dot on support or oppose. So I agree, not neutral maybe, but need more information or undecided might be an option.
All right, if there are no additional questions, either in the room or online, let's just quickly move to next steps, which is the next slide, please. So we have a stakeholder comment period. It's pretty long. We tried to keep in mind everything that's going on within the CAISO process too. It would be great to get stakeholder comments by May 15th. There is an email address where you can send those in, and we've posted a comments template with some questions that we're hoping to get stakeholders' input on, along with our discussion paper. The sector liaisons are also open to just talking with stakeholders about how this transition process might occur. And so I'd also encourage the RIF community to reach out to your sector liaisons if you would like to have a conversation about this initiative. And with that, I think we're going to take a quick break. Oh, okay. Do you want to, why don't you go ahead and mention that?
Yeah, just one thing to add. If you are looking for the paper or for the comment template, the links to both of those are at the bottom of the agenda for today's meeting. They are on the RIF website under reports, but I know that can be a little hard to find sometimes. So those links are highlighted. There is the comment template link that goes to a Word version of the comment template. So you can just go ahead and use that document if you like.
And now I think we're ready for.
Now we're ready for
a break. Should we do 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's
See
come
you
back at
in-
11:20. All right. Welcome to our market scenes panel. This is our last session of the meeting today. This panel is going to be co-moderated by myself, Ali Mace, and Vijay Satyal. And we each have a few opening remarks, so I'm going to kick it off and then hand it to Vijay, and then we'll get into our panelists. Just a few logistic things. Each panelist is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and we're aiming to have 30 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. We'll see how we do on that. But just a little bit of background in thinking about this panel that we're bringing today. So we've had many discussions on the RIF about relevant topics and the important topics to talk about. And as you could tell from the roundtable conversation, market themes have been consistently identified as a topic that many of our sectors are interested and concerned about. Since we see much evidence there will be day ahead market themes in the West, and we felt that it's important to support learning on this themes topic and discussion of moving forward to address themes. So today, this is our first panel in a series. Vijay will talk about panel number 2 in his comments. So this is panel 1 is intended as really an introduction to market themes, what they are, why we should care about them, some context about experiences in other markets, both how they've worked, how they've been handled, and some context on how we've handled themes that already exist here in the West. So we're hoping today that those that our attendees learn more about both about experiences in Eastern markets and our experiences today in the West, and start to, if you haven't already, many of you already probably have lots of thoughts on how that experience may or may not apply to market scenes in the West and where we go from here. We will have 3 panelists today. We're going to let each provide a brief introduction of themselves as they begin. After Vijay's opening remarks, we're going to start with John Tsoukalis of Brattle Group, and then move to Richard Dowling with Great Strategies, and finally Ted Koheiser of Bonneville Power. I'll hand it over to Vijay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so a year ago, I brought up themes as a suggestion to the RIF, and I got some unhappy looks, and I was even told, Vijay, you're thinking too fast, too hard. And the favorite statement, the really cool statement I got is, half the people don't even understand what it is. Good luck trying to get this conversation going. And look where we are. So appreciate that. I think I've already conveyed the PIO sector, especially believes one large market is best. The bigger the market, lower the inefficiencies, less the seams. However, since we may not be in that situation yet, this is a level setting panel that we wanted to have. For those who were able to attend the YRM courtesy meeting, anybody there last week, you may have heard Commissioner Judy Chenning say something really cool. She said, seams management is critical, whether irrespective of you having a market or not. But if you have 2 markets, good fences make good neighbors. So you are truly lucky to have some experts here, and Richard especially. When I close by saying seams means different things to different people. To me, I look at it as a kaleidoscope. You turn it one way, you'll see one kind of seams. You turn it another way, you may see another kind of seams. So we already have RCs doing reliability coordination, but from the market side, we appreciate this setup. The session number 2 in June, I hope you can attend, will be where we dive deeper into Western seams and how they could manifest, and what currently is being done and what should be done. And the last thing I'll just say is I have good news. This morning, Richard has also been selected to be on the seams work group at SPP. So we will have a common denominator that can work and talk across both markets. Thank you. And we'll give it to the panel.
I guess I'm up first. Is that right?
It is. Thank you, John. I'm just gonna cue you.
Okay. Can you all hear me well?
We can. Yes.
Okay. Great. So thanks for having me. I apologize I can't be there in person with all of you today, but thanks for having me virtually. For those of you who don't know me, my name's John Tsoukalis. I'm a principal at the Brattle Group. I've been with Brattle now, all told, about 15 years, and I've spent the last 10 doing a lot of work in the Western US as kind of markets have developed out there. So yeah,
Oh,
He has to say.
he just froze. Uh-oh.
When he's speaking.
That looks, he was speaking, it looks like it may be on his end. Sorry. If we.
But something that answer.
Yeah, it's lost. They're running the same right now. Yeah, if John, if you're still speaking, can hear us, we can't hear you. And your video has gone. We may adapt here and switch to Richard while we work this out. Let's do that. Okay. Alice, can we go ahead on the slides? I'm not sure which number. Let's flip through. We're going to go ahead and skip to Richard while hopefully John can work out his connection, and I'll email him. So it will be
104.
Thank you. Slide 104.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. So I met some of you before and worked closely with some of you before in the past, but for many of you, first time meeting you. So thanks for inviting me to the RIP today. I spent 20 years prior to my current role at Grid Strategies, we're a consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. area, doing a lot of work on energy markets, transmission planning, policy. Prior to that, I spent 20 years at MISO, where I held a variety of positions. Started there in 2002, helped with the original market design of the MISO markets and implementation of those markets. And as part of the 20 years there, I was responsible for operations, real-time operations, market design, so a variety of roles. And intimately involved with work on seams issues. And I'll talk about some of the interesting seams issues MISO has had in the past, as well as negotiating with various seams neighbors over the years. And I can talk some about the different types of seams that can emerge between markets, and be happy to answer any questions that you all may have there. I think there's good news for the West, and that is that electrical engineering is the same in both the West and the East interconnections, and a lot of the lessons learned from seams and how to deal with parallel path flow issues that have been learned in the East are very applicable to the West. They're distinctives, to be sure, and I'll talk about some things that I believe will be important to look at specific issues as we try and address seams, market seams in the West, based on some of the differences between how congestion management has historically been dealt with in the Western interconnect versus the Eastern interconnection, important to address those going forward. So with that, if we could go to the first slide, first picture on the left-hand side, seams. We all know about seams in the electric utility industry. For years and years, individual utilities were not interconnected. They operated as islands, and we know that there are lots of seams that exist today because we have lots of different functions in order to keep the power system operating. We have balancing areas, we have reliability coordinators, we have transmission service providers, we have transmission operators. So we have seams within companies. As I know, we'll hear from the experience with Bonneville, they have seams within their own system where they have generation and load on multiple different utility systems. That's not unique to Bonneville. That happens. It's the country, and it happens within RTOs, which we'll see here in a moment. So seams are not something new. And what's important when we talk about market seams is not to get lost in the weeds of all the different types of seams that can exist out there today. The fact that we have lots of balancing areas, lots of reliability coordinators, multiple reliability coordinators, we don't need to get hung up on the fact that there are lots of places where there could be seams. What's important is to focus on where it matters. And where it matters are where it can interfere with trade, where it can impose barriers to otherwise efficient transactions, where it can cause reliability problems, or where it can result in cost shifts, where some transmission users are unfairly charged for use of the transmission system or for other people's use of the transmission system. Those are the kind of areas that we need to focus on. So I'll try and focus on the issues that have been important in the east. I think it'll be very helpful in the west as we try and tackle these issues to identify the issues that actually matter and to prioritize which ones we're going to work on first, because otherwise it's really easy. And it was a great discussion this morning talking about how easy it is to put together a list of everything that you'd like to work on. We'd like to work on lots of market issues. There are dozens and dozens, and we could stage them out over the next 15 or 20 years. At MISO, we had a plan every year coming out at least 10 years for market improvements. Those lists are sure easy to create. So it's important to have some way of prioritizing the issues that you're going to work on. And that's one of the things we'll talk about today. So one of the first things we know about how to address seams in a market context, it's by having well configured markets. So on the right hand side here, this is just a map that shows the different RTOs in the country. It doesn't show that we have well established markets in the West with WEM, WEIS. Those are not shown on the map here. This is only showing the RTOs. And the RTO boundaries here, I'm showing for a very specific reason, and we'll get to in a moment. The boundaries matter a lot. The seams between RTO markets matter a lot in terms of the impact on trade and in terms of the efficiency, the economic outcomes, the outcomes for ratepayers, as well as for reliability. And we'll talk about that. For those of you in the room, I think the picture there is big enough. You can see that the seam actually between MISO and MISO and itself, actually, if you look at the northern portion and the southern portion there in orange, a very small interconnection connecting MISO Central and MISO South. That would otherwise be a fairly important seam. It turns out that it is reasonably well managed. It's big enough given the size of the two areas that it's interconnecting. But it's also important that it is electrically connected north and south. And we'll talk about the importance of having contiguous markets on a later slide. But you can also notice if you look at PJM and MISO, the orange versus, I guess it's a kind of a yellow or gold color there. Commonwealth Edison sits in the middle of MISO, completely disconnected on the map. It's not actually electrically disconnected from PJM. It's a highly overlapping transmission system. Commonwealth Edison is connected via American Electric Power and First Energy to the rest of the utilities in Ohio. But the mere fact that it is both well integrated with all of the regional utilities, so all the rest of the utilities in Wisconsin, Illinois, very well interconnected with Commonwealth Edison, you'll see there are significant market outcomes that you get as a result of where that seam happens to be drawn. So the electrical interconnection is good. The market seam turns out to be more important when you look at the financial implications of seams. So next slide, why do we care about the issue at all? With the introduction of day-ahead markets, we're going to see big changes in generation dispatch and commitment, and those will result in changes in transmission flows. So when you think about an individual utility committing generation within their own utility footprint, they've got a relatively small geographic area. They commit their own generation for their own load. They built their transmission service to serve that load, and the generation flows pretty smoothly over their own wires. Some loop flows on neighbors, but that's been built into the system, and we have processes to deal with when we have congestion that results from loop flow in the system. That loop flow is going to change a lot when you go to a day-ahead market, and that's because instead of an individual utility committing its own generation for its own load, you're committing generation across a very big geographic region. So just like when CAISO started, you could, in the day-ahead market, end up committing a generating resource in Southern California to serve load in Northern California. You never would have had that before with PG&E in Southern California, Edison operating independently. Operating together, suddenly they do. And so what you have is a new south to north flow that would have been considered in the past loop flow. It no longer is. It's just market flow. So you get a change in the flow dynamics on the system. That's point number one for why seams are important. The second important issue is that flow is invisible to the way that we manage congestion today. We managed that congestion in the past when if we did want to turn on that generator in Southern California to serve load in Northern California, we would have a point-to-point transmission tag. We would monitor that transmission. We would know exactly where it was coming from, where it was going to, and if it caused the loop flow in the system, we could point to it and say, I see where the source is.
curtail that point-to-point tag and it'll take care of my congestion. When you incorporate that decision about which generator to turn on into a market dispatch, those tags are gone. They don't exist anymore. To the extent there's now loop flow on that system, it's a market transaction. It's just part of a big pot of generation that's been turned on to serve load. So all of your ability to monitor loop flow and monitor the sources of loop flow and curtail them using the methods that we have today, methods that exist in the East as well as in the West to curtail tags, your visibility of those flows diminishes, and it's very difficult to use the existing protocols to manage loop flow. So two problems: you change loop flow, you can no longer manage it because you don't have visibility into the sources of loop flow on the system. That's why seams management is a big deal when you have two markets that are sitting on top of each other. That's really job number one for seams management. Get control of how you manage loop flow on the system, because you're changing loop flow patterns and your current tools are not effective to deal with the new loop flow that you see. So what does it take to deal with that reliability problem? You end up needing joint operating agreements between the two markets that are dispatching those systems. They are thousands of pages. They get litigated in federal court as well as at FERC over decades. And 20 years into having them in place, they're still being thought about after we and stakeholder processes. So they're not a panacea, but they are necessary where you have market seams, because the issues that are associated with market seams have to be addressed. You can't ignore the fact that you have loop flow on the system. It's got to be managed in order to maintain reliability, and you have to address market issues that we'll talk about, second set of issues that are coming, that will come along. So what do you need to do in the West to deal with this that's different than the East? I talked about how there are distinctives. One thing we don't have in the West, unfortunately, is a uniform congestion management protocol that's used by all utilities. And that turns out to be a necessary underpinning. If you're going to have some form of joint and common market operating agreement between two market operators, they've got to be based on the same foundation, and that foundation does not currently exist in the West. And so that's going to be something that we'll need to change. And luckily, there's an effort that's been underway for a few years. It's currently at NASB, the ECC effort, and that is moving towards a process that will provide that underpinning that's necessary for a joint operating agreement between two different markets operating in the West. And at its heart, what that foundation allows you to do is to have a set of rules where, and I'm going to use the word market operators, it's really everybody in this room. It's every utility, everyone who has a generator, everyone who has load to serve that cares about these issues. It's not the market operators. It allows everyone to agree on how to allocate rights to use the transmission system. So if you've sold point-to-point service, you've bought the right to use transmission service from someone who owns those wires. It turns out you're also using the neighbor's wires through loop flow. What a joint operating agreement and a standard approach to congestion management allows is a method to calculate what your share of all of your neighboring systems entitlements are. And then that gets used for dispatch purposes. But it's necessary. If you don't have that, if you have ad hoc congestion management, or at least not even ad hoc, it's not to suggest that it isn't well structured and working. It's that it's different by different people who are using the system. You can't have a system of allocating access to the system and curtailments to the system that everyone will deem to be fair, reasonable, and fair to their end users, for the people who are at the end of the day paying for the energy on the system. So that's really the biggest issue, which is why I wanted to spend the most time on it. When you talk about seams issues, again, there's reliability, which is primarily loop flow. I like to think about seams agreements as first, don't burn down the neighbor system. Don't unduly underutilize the transmission system, and then encourage economic flows on the system. The first one, you've got to get that in place. If you don't have that in place, you realistically cannot operate two markets side by side. They've got to be able to manage these flows. So that's why I wanted to spend probably most of my time on that one. But let's look about the economic issues as well, because they're very important. And there's one element that we have here in the West that makes this extremely important. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is showing you just the map of the RTO boundaries again. Again, point your attention to the northern part of Illinois there, Commonwealth Edison. And it is part of PJM, but it is both electrically and physically within the MISO region as well. On the left-hand side, you can see there's a price map, and that's just showing a typical operating day. And a couple things to point out here. One, you can see that the prices are pretty uniform across PJM, and relatively low. So this is a mild day. And you can see the energy is flowing back and forth between the rest of PJM and the northern Illinois portion of PJM. Prices are very uniform there. You'll notice, though, that the prices are lower all around northern Illinois. So Wisconsin, the rest of Illinois, prices there are lower, $10 or so lower. That is all price energy that could have flown into the Commonwealth Northern Illinois area, resulted in lower prices in that area. The energy doesn't flow. Why doesn't it flow? There are barriers built into the market seams. There you have to buy transmission, you have to schedule the transmission. You're taking, as someone who's trading it, all of the price risk and volatility risk associated with that transaction. And we're going to hear on the presentation that was interrupted why trading has simply not worked at market seams in the eastern RTOs in the past. And Grid Strategies put out a paper mid last year. Be happy to make sure you all have access to that. It's publicly available, that talks about the experience and the lack of success with market mechanisms to address seams in the east. So that's one issue. The energy doesn't trade even where it's obviously economic and efficient for it to trade. It's a financial hurdle. You'll also notice on the western part of the MISO footprint, we have very high and negative prices. In that case, we have a lot of bottled up wind, and there are some physical transmission constraints that are contributing to that. Sure, that's what's stopping that energy from moving towards the eastern part of the MISO region. But what you don't see on this map, and it's just because a map wasn't available and I'm not clever enough to create one using the historical data, SPP is on the other side of that, and that low-cost energy could have flown into SPP, and it didn't for the same reason. SPP had positive prices that day. MISO was running negative prices that day. There's a lot of value for consumers to have that energy flowing across that seam. There'd be a lot of money to be made by traders to have that energy flowing across that seam, but the barriers to trade are simply too high. And so that energy doesn't flow. Again, the analysis around that question of the barriers being too high is ample. The market monitors in the eastern market study this every year, and the data is out there to show you why it seems just put an absolute barrier. The next slide just shows another example of this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. This is using a very typical spring day. I took this over the weekend. This is off a public website all of you would have access to. And you'll note here in the Chicago area, again, the prices were very negative in this case. In the Chicago, next slide, sorry. They're there now. Prices here in the Chicago area were negative. You can see that it would have been valuable for that negative price energy to flow into the MISO region. Well, interconnected, no physical transmission constraints there, but also it requires market participants to engage in transactions that they find very risky and expensive to engage in, so they don't. As a consequence, you end up with a lot of bottled up cheap energy. You can also see on this one, New England and New York, and New York is an interesting outlier. Standing there being $10 or so more expensive than both New England or PJM. Be a lot of value to be able to trade in and out of New York, but same issues there. There are just practical barriers to the economic movement of energy when you have markets. If we move to the next slide, this is a special situation that you're going to have in the West. It will be difficult to deal with just because we don't have any good historical precedents for how we would deal with this. And that is, we have currently a non-contiguous market footprint in all of the other markets, joint operating agreements that are out there. We're dealing with market seams moving energy from one market to another market. We don't have any existing markets where the markets are disconnected and they're in their own isolated zones without physical transmission connecting them. And that is in fact the case for what we have right now in the Markets Plus region. It's not clear based on all of the announcements whether or not EDAM would be contiguous based on where everyone lands. We have to see where everyone decides they're going to go at the end of the day. But it does introduce special problems. Currently, you can have market mechanisms in place to tag across the boundary of an RTO. We don't have any good examples. And in this case, if you wanted to move from El Paso, for example, up to Colorado, you would have to drive out of a El Paso Market Plus zone into EDAM, across EDAM, so a through transaction, and then a drive-in transaction back into Colorado. So you actually have multiple schedules there and multiple settlement issues that you'll have to work through in order to figure out how that's actually going to play out for the person who's engaged in that transaction. But as it is, there is no ability to centrally dispatch and commit all of the resources within those separate subzones and have an optimal unit commitment and dispatch. It's going to require people to use transmission service that they own on someone else's system in order to move that energy. To the extent we have examples, situations like this in the West, that's going to be a special problem. In some respects, maybe it's easier. There are fewer seams issues. There isn't an actual seam here. You have multiple different entities trying to send energy back and forth to each other. It's just that typical transmission service. But that's certainly not delivering the value that we want out of markets. So it's an issue that is going to have to be addressed. The closest we've seen to how to address this would be between the MISO North and the MISO South region that I talked about earlier. There is physical transmission there. It's under a contract, so it's contract path. So you can create legal and tariff mechanisms to deal with that, but it does require some ownership. It does require contractual rights that are different from simply transmission service. And in the case of MISO North and South, that one did go up and down through the courts a couple of times. It's a multi-party agreement that facilitates those transactions between TVA, Southern Company, SPP, MISO, and Associated Electric Cooperative. It's several $1 million a month checks that get written back and forth. Standing committees that meet every month to talk about it, and it's not pretty, but it's possible to make anything work. So that concludes, I think, most of the comments for issues that you'll see. What can we do about that? Looking at the next page, the biggest opportunity is going to be through addressing congestion management. Market-to-market congestion management is going to be job number one. If you could move to the next slide, please. That will be critical to put into place. Dealing with what could otherwise be islands where the markets are not contiguous, that will be the second most important issue in my mind that you can deal with. And then lastly, we know from the Eastern markets that you're not going to be able to eliminate the barriers to efficient energy transactions. We just do not have good examples of that. I know we're going to have a suggestion, an argument from one of the panelists why interchange optimization could help solve that. It is a potential long-term solution. It is also incredibly complex and has not been tried here. And given the configuration of the West, I have my own doubts about whether or not it would be feasible. But there are other things that we can put on our long laundry list of market enhancements that we could try, and that would be one of them. But we should do everything we can to reduce barriers. So while trade does not happen as much as we would like, you can eliminate as many barriers as you can to efficient market transactions. Getting rid of rate pancaking is good, very unpopular with people who own transmission. So I'm clear that would be a big seller out here. They did eliminate transmission rate pancaking between MISO and PJM. They weren't able to do it between MISO and SPP. So in some cases, people can get together and agree to do it, but not necessarily everywhere. But that would be valuable to do. Looking at things like scheduling timelines and scheduling requirements to minimize friction for people who would like to engage in transactions is also very valuable. And getting interface pricing right is critical. And that gets talked about a lot. It's being talked about right now. Markets Plus has a task force that's looking at interface pricing. It's going to need to be picked up in EDAM as well. And it will be complicated by the fact that you do potentially have multiple island portions of the market may well end up with multiple interfaces that people have to trade. But it's going to require both CAISO and SPP getting together to figure that out. You can't do that on one side and impose it on the rest of the world. Everyone has to get together and define the rules for how those interchange transactions are. And I will be happy to answer any questions that people have when we do that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. With that, we have John back on the phone, I believe, and we should be able to, yeah, good sign. Tell us if we could go back to slide 85. And then I will hand it over to John to present his slides.
Hey everyone, sorry about that. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm gonna keep my video off, so maybe that will help with the connection. So yeah, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. I have an option to control it here in the webinar. I don't know if that changes in the room for you all.
Yes, we just saw it change. We're good.
Okay, perfect. So then I can do that myself. So I don't know how far I got before I was cut off, but I was explaining or walking through the 5 kind of ways which we can see seams cause inefficiencies, and I liked Vijay's comment at the beginning that seams means different things to different people. And we see that kind of manifest itself in how seams are treated, right? When you organize folks into a market, certain things happen as a result of that, especially in RTO market where transmission planning functions and generation interconnection functions and a common resource adequacy framework flow from an RTO. So not all of these necessarily are applicable in the WEC, but I think they're good kind of history lessons or lessons from the East that we can take over. So we do see transmission planning, interregional planning has basically been ineffective in the East. There are some interregional planning processes, but they tend to produce very little. Generation interconnection too is an area where RTOs could cooperate more. We saw some success there with SPP and MISO's joint transmission interconnection queue study. And that study showed that you could reduce cost interconnection by 50% by cooperating. Resource adequacy is another area where markets can cooperate and where seams can cause friction, particularly with imports of resource adequacy resources into one market or another. The markets in the East tend to
Okay, we're going to pause for just a moment and see if I'm suggesting that John maybe try calling in if he was using computer audio. We'll see if we can get him back on in a moment. Otherwise, we will we'll pivot to Todd in just a moment. Sorry this is it's a meeting with really good luck on audio. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. All right, we're gonna, sorry, once again, go down. Let's see, I'm gonna figure out which slide Todd starts on, and we'll just keep jumping around here, and hopefully we'll get John back on again. So Silas, it's slide 112. There we go, you're ahead of me. Okay, so with that pause, we're going to move to Todd Koheiser.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Richard. That was excellent. I found myself at least nodding a lot internally, if not visibly.
My name is Todd Koheiser. I work at the Bonneville Power Administration. View. I've been at Bonneville for a very, very long time and done a lot of different things. I'm an electrical engineer by training, and I've spent most of my career at Bonneville dealing with operational issues. So transmission system operations, love control centers. Last decade or so, I've been almost focused exclusively on market development in the West, and also as part of the Bonneville team that helped us join the energy and balance market. And more recently, obviously, very engaged in the initiatives. So as part of that work, I've worked on SEAMs my entire life. And if you can go to the next slide, I think the one thing I've learned is complex, and complexity seems almost like entropy in the WEC. There's more and more of it over time. And so I thought, as I was preparing for this, went in the past, thought about the present and the future, and I think it all lines up pretty nicely to prove my point that things are getting more complex. Next slide, please. This was 1958. This is from a paper that I ran across a number of years ago. Paper written in 1958 by the branch of system operations of the Bonneville Power Administration. And it's a short 6-ish page document with some pictures in it that describes how interconnected operations worked in the Pacific Northwest circa 1958. And by this time, 1958, the Pacific Northwest had been predominantly interconnected. Starting in the 20s and all the way through the 40s and into the early 50s, you saw, utilities getting together and connecting themselves, like Tacoma and Seattle, or Vista, which was Washington Water Power back in the day, connecting to Montana and Idaho, etc. But the fact that you could describe how interconnected utility operations worked in 1958 in 6 pages, pretty simple. Matter of fact, Bonneville sat in the middle and acted as the clearinghouse. People called us every hour with their schedules and their actuals, and we kept tallies and did all the after the fact reconciliation. Paper and telephones. That's how it worked. It was simple. We're all jealous. Okay, actually, but we can't do that anymore. Next slide. The complexity is just continually increased over time. So today, WEC consists of 38 balancing authorities, and there's at least 30 transmission service providers and probably as many transmission operators. We have 4 reliability coordinators. We've built out this impressive machine. People would call it the largest and most complex machine in the world, power grid. So there's been a lot of additions made. We've gone through deregulation and open access. We've got new organized markets that exist. We had the variable energy revolution that's still underway, and we forgot how to integrate all of that. We're still trying to figure out how to integrate that. And in the Pacific Northwest, we've actually kind of created a very interesting mess in some ways. The Pacific Northwest, very few of those BAAs in the Northwest. There's adjacent just to Bonneville, there's 18 balancing authorities. Very few of them are actually contiguous. They're often non-contiguous, and they use transmission service they acquire from other folks like Bonneville. Bonneville is a very large transmission service provider. And even Bonneville's BAA is non-contiguous. And we're spread across 6 states, and again, adjacent to 18 balancing authority areas, 360 ties. We're adjacent to 15 TSPs. Some of those TSPs are inside of our BAA. It's complicated, right? It's more complicated than what I described from 1958. Next slide, please. This is just a picture of sort of the footprint of the BAAs in the Pacific Northwest on the left, and on the right is the footprint of the Bonneville BAA and a lot of our transmission assets. And this picture doesn't do justice, because you really have to take the picture on the left and do it in 3D, hold it kind of flat, because they're kind of stacked on top of each other. It's complicated. Next slide. So what's the future look like? Yeah, I think Richard did a good job of describing a lot of the concerns and issues. This is just a picture I had lying around, but it shows Bonneville in the center, because that's how I always draw these types of things. Power of the pen, but it kind of shows the landscape for Bonneville and all of its adjacents. And, we have a lot of EIM entities. We also have those that are not in any organized market. And we've also got a number of entities that have clearly identified an EDAM leaning. And of course, we all know who some of the markets plus leaning entities are. So even just within the Pacific Northwest, it was complicated, that previous slide. It's going to be even more complicated, this slide. So next slide. So what seems, I just have a laundry list of them, to be honest. I think Richard did a really good job of probably saying same thing, what I'm going to say more artfully, but the next slide, please. So again, things become more complex over time. Richard said it, seams are not new. Again, we've been dealing with them since the beginning in utility. We all deal with them. Load serving entities, merchants, marketers. This is just the nature of the game. And so, we're really good. I mean, over the last 75, 80 years, we've become really good at managing all of these BAAs and TSPs and the non-contiguous nature of them. But again, adding non-contiguous day-ahead markets on top of that is going to increase complexity. And, it's going to create new operational and commercial seams and impact those that already exist. Next slide. So here's a laundry list of types of operational seams. Many of these just exist today and, may become more complex to manage in the future. We have reliability coordinators today. There's 4 of them in the Western Interconnection. They're generally contiguous. That is, they're covering a nice geographic area. That, I don't know, in the future they'll have nice contiguous RC footprints. Maybe, maybe not. We have all the balancing authority areas. Some will be in one market, some in another market, some in neither. All the transmission operators that exist today, we have seams today between transmission operators. That's really common in the Northwest, where again, Bonneville is a big transmission service provider and operator, but also our utilities that we provide transmission service to are also transmission operators. So we often have a lot of work to make those seams efficient. Transmission constraints and market congestion. Richard spent a good amount of time talking about that. Couldn't agree more. Congestion management adjunct to that. Something that we deal with in the Pacific Northwest is dynamic transfer limitations. So the ability of the system to support dynamically changing flows. That is already very complex to manage. And, I can see that becoming even more complex as you have multiple markets trying to access the same dynamic capacity of the system in order to achieve reliable and economic outcomes. We also have interconnection viability operating limits. Those are extremely important because those are big seams, big issues that we have to manage collectively to make sure we keep the entire Western interconnection reliable. And so, Bonneville's has several that was a part of. Another thing that's always been a lot of work for us is outage coordination and making sure that everybody knows what outages plan and coming up and making sure that we're doing that in a reliable, coordinated way. That hasn't gotten easier, gotten harder. And again, having multiple market operators, new RCs in different regions, that becomes a critically important process to do well. And operational studies, those rely on a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions may be harder to make with a non-contiguous market footprint, so just having multiple markets. Next slide. Commercial seams examples. Might not read these all in the interest of time, but hopefully these all look familiar to some of you. Worth noting, there's a lot of joint owned transmission in the Northwest as well. That's one I might like to point out. And so you can have entities in different markets wanting to use their share of their transmission asset ownership, in different markets, but you still have transmission operators, one for those assets. And so that end up getting could be quite interesting. Remote load, that's Richard obviously mentioned that. This is something that Bonneville, for example, has load pockets and generation in other EAAs that might be in different markets, as an example. And then just as a host of, oats and tariffs and business practice discrepancies, across all these different parties. Price formation between markets, which again, already covered that. Transmission rights and how they're used and leveraged, in the case of a non-contiguous market footprint, we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to move energy between those zones. Next slide. Seams agreements. I can envision many types of seams agreements. Those between market operators, those are, like those JOAs that Richard mentioned. We also have bilateral seams agreements, like between Bonneville and the California ISO. So it's possible different types of entity to market operator type of agreements may also be necessary. Which type? I don't know, but there will be some. I was impressed that Richard said some of these joint operating agreements are over 1,000 pages. I found the ones that I did look at were around 400 pages. And this section right here is the congestion management process, the CMP master, is just an attachment to a much larger agreement. It's actually a very good read. I've clearly read it and I carry it around, oddly enough, and I use it as a prop. So that these agreements are complex, and I have heard, that, and I've said also in the past that writing an agreement is actually the easy part. Implementing them is the hard part, and a lot of those agreements in the East haven't been fully implemented completely, right? And my own experience with some of our seams agreements has been, took 9 months to negotiate it and 2 years to implement it. So you're not done, you just started once you have a sign. So next slide. Conclusion slide, thank goodness. Anyways, my story is things are becoming more complex in the WEC. Seams introduce complexity. Complexity creates operational and commercial challenges. Market and RC footprints will impact the number and type of seams and associated operational challenges. PPA and other entities in the region, we're going to need to work collaboratively to address those operational challenges and complexity caused by seams. And regardless of market decisions, seams are going to exist. Seams between centrally cleared markets and between market and non-market areas will likely necessitate agreements. We don't know what they all are yet. And I think it's going to be complex, but possible to address all these. It takes time and effort. And I think I put that last bullet in there for myself. But I hope I can share it with you. Stay positive. And we have really smart people like Richard and other people that have dealt with a lot of these complexities already. And we'll figure it out.
Great, thank you, Todd. Okay, we have John on the phone now. So we're not gonna lose connection. I can hear him. So Allison, we can go back to slide 86 where we were. Then John, I will hand it back to you. We are gonna go past 12:30. So I know folks had to leave at 12:30.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Speak out. Yes, we can hear you, John.
So can you all hear me?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yes, okay, great.
Okay.
Let's see if third time is a charm here. I'm gonna take Todd's final message of staying positive that the connection will work this time. We'll see how that goes. So I've already tried to do this slide 3 times now, so I'm just gonna skip to which is inefficient trading, which is, I'm sorry?
We were just laughing.
Okay. So inefficient trading, which is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this presentation, and really kind of give a little bit of a history lesson of what has happened in the East between markets and how that process has evolved over the last 20 years. So let's go to the next slide, slide 87. So the first entity that I'm aware of that kind of pointed this out was Potomac Economics, which is the market monitor for several markets in the East. They pointed out back in, David Patton, who's the market monitor, pointed out in a presentation back in 2003, so now 22 years ago, documented some of the inefficient utilization of interregional transmission. And then about 7 years later, they put out another study that estimated the value of optimizing interties between several of the Eastern markets, MISO, PJM, New York, New England, and the Canadian system operators, would yield somewhere between 150 and $300 million a year in cost savings. So that's the first kind of quantification of the value that I'm aware of in the East. And that spurred kind of the next year, New York and ISO New England proposed some ways to kind of address those inefficiencies. So if we go to the next slide, slide 88, that 2011 proposal was the first proposal that put out intertie between 2 of the Eastern RTOs. And there's some interesting tidbits from that proposal that I have here in the bullet points, pointing out how kind of inefficient transactions were across the seams at that time. So the second bullet down, the ISO's analysis showed that, nearly half the time, power was flowing in the wrong direction. So basically flowing against the economics in a economically efficient manner. And then the next bullet down shows that even in hours where the price delta exceeded $10 per megawatt hour, you still had in 1/3 of those hours available transmission capacity between the markets that wasn't being used. So it goes to show that this is not only happening in hours where price deltas are relatively small, but quite big. It takes quite a big delta before traders start to flow power. So this is kind of what was illustrated in Richard's pictures before, and shows that we had evidence of this going back now for about 15 years in the East, at least 15 years, documented evidence. This analysis in 2011 also pointed out 3 root causes, right? One is latency delay. So basically the time between when interties had to be scheduled and when power actually flowed and LMPs were set. System conditions actually changed a lot, and so there was a risk there for traders. If you incorrectly forecast how things are going to be, you're exposed to that risk. Uneconomic clearing. So basically, ISOs make decisions about tie schedules without economic coordination, and then also transaction costs. So Richard touched on this as well in his presentation, right? You have to pay for transmission, but also there are other kind of fees that create hurdles and disincentivize trading. So this analysis by the two ISOs in the East laid out these kind of three causes. So if we go to the next slide, so the ISOs at that time offered two possible solutions. They offered intertie optimization, which is effectively something very similar to least cost economic dispatch that the markets used to clear internally and would rely on bid-based offers. And there would be a optimization of the intertie, and there's different options for how you could do this. I very much agree with Richard's assessment earlier. This is complicated, so it's not easy to do. But I would say one example that we have functioning in the West today, or actually two examples really, are the two energy imbalance markets. WEM is a form of intertie optimization. In some ways, you can think of it almost as the ultimate or kind of best case form of intertie optimization. But there are other ways you could do it too. And I have a slide in the appendix that lays some of those out for folks that are interested. The other option that was presented at that time in 2011 was coordinated transaction scheduling, or CTS, which basically is a facilitation of bilateral trading in real time. So it's also known as kind of interface bidding or intertie bidding. So basically, you know, traders, would be trader based, would come in and have to put in bids to buy or sell power at the market seam. And there would be a coordination clearing of those bids between the two markets. So the recommendations for kind of, or both of these options were put forward, and the ISOs actually recommended doing intertie optimization. But because of the complexities, and again, because folks thought that CTS would be almost as efficient, you know, the thinking at that time was that you would get most of the benefit with very little of the implementation cost. CTS is what was ultimately implemented between New York and New England, and later between PJM and MISO. And the kind of takeaway, though, is that that has not worked. And I'm going to show you some evidence on the next slides here in a moment about that. And I think the kind of takeaway, or the lesson, once something gets put in place, it's really hard to change. And which is why I'm glad this conversation in the West is happening now, and why, you know, I know VJ and others have been pushing for this for a while, to have this conversation, because in a lot of ways now is the time to think through how market seams will be managed, you know, as the new day ahead markets are developing in the West. So if we go to the next slide, slide 90, and I'll just point at the bottom here and talk through that a little bit. The MISO M&M market monitoring unit put out in their State of the Market report a couple of years ago some evidence about, you know, what would be the benefit created by moving to a 5-minute CTS. So right now, coordinated transaction scheduling happens on a 15-minute basis. The MISO market monitor found that, you know, 40% of transactions under CTS are unprofitable. And then what they proposed a solution where we move to kind of a more granular basis of that. So it's kind of an intermediary solution between what exists today and something closer to, you know, real-time intertie optimization, and found that you would get, you know, maybe an additional $15 million benefit on the PJM seam, and if you implemented it on the SPP seam, you would get $45 million of benefits. If we go to the next slide, slide 91, similarly, this is evidence from the PJM market monitor. So they've been looking at this also for about 10 years and have been recommending intertie optimization as well. What the tables show you at the bottom there is that, you know, the first column of, the first table looks at the PJM MISO seam. The second table looks at the PJM New York seam. And the first kind of column of that table shows you price difference. And the second column shows you what portion of hours, or the number of hours, I should say, that we see inconsistent flows between the markets. So this is moving in the wrong direction for economic efficiency. And obviously that number diminishes as the price spread grows, but you can still see that, you know, again, at $10, you've got, roughly a third to a half of the hours are flowing in the wrong direction. And then even at $20 price delta, you've got, 15 to 25% of the hours are flowing in the wrong direction. So, a lot of wasted value there, basically, and a lot of lost value. So if we go to the next slide, slide 92, this lays out a little bit of, explanation of what the difference between coordinated transaction scheduling and intertie optimization. And I won't go through this point by point, but, to focus on the intertie optimization side of this, to give you a sense of what that might look like, basically it would optimize the intertie every 5 minutes at the same time that markets optimize their internal, clearing. Again, it would use transmission that remains between the markets after bilateral scheduling has closed and after bilateral trading has closed. So again, at the 5-minute basis. So kind of similar to how EIM works in the West in that regard, right? If you owned transmission rights between two markets, you could schedule them, but then at the real time, time horizon, that would become available for intertie optimization. It would be hurdle free. So again, transmission would be made available for free. And again, because it's only residual transmission, most of it would, the transmission owner would still be able to either use or sell their rights up until the real time. So again, it does de-pancaking, of course, may create revenue shifts and things like that, but because it's only incremental transmission, you kind of would deal with it the same way that it's dealt with in EIM today. And then, of course, because it's optimized, the value of those transactions would be shared across the different market members, right? Prices might go up on one side, so generators would earn more, but then they would go down on the other side, and load would pay less. And not only in the Western EIM is there kind of an example of this kind of intertie optimization happening today, but also in Europe, they have market decoupling, which works similar, between the national markets. So if we go to the next slide, and actually we can go on to the one after that, slide 94. I wanted to give a sense of what value you might find from doing this in the West. We haven't really estimated this, but some of the studies we've done that are out there publicly, can be used to kind of infer what the value of this might be in the West. So this slide is showing you a range of different market footprints we simulated on behalf of NV Energy and presented to their commission in Nevada last year. And as you can see, we're simulating basically a range of different footprints that go from kind of what we call bookend EDM and bookend markets plus, with different participation scenarios at the time based on who had announced or not announced, or who this was kind of like I said, a year ago, or even a little bit more than that. So the lay of the land has changed a bit, but this at least gives you a sense of kind of a range of different possibilities in the West. And if you go to the next slide, slide 95, you can see circled in the bottom here the values, the benefits to customers that we found across that range of footprints. And so all of those scenarios produce large benefits relative to the status quo. That's not a surprise given the spread of day-ahead markets, but you can see that there's a range, going from kind of the bookend EDM case where most of the West is in the one market, is close to $1 billion a year of benefits. And it's about $150 million a year delta between kind of the lowest case and the highest case here. So what that kind of shows or infers is if you were able to do seams optimization, and we're able to actually effectively, kind of have almost like a real-time imbalance market, day-ahead markets, I think the upper bound kind of potential here, at least based on these studies, is likely to be, in the range of $150 million a year for Western customers. So it's not nothing, right? We're talking about substantial benefits, and that's, I would say, probably an underestimate because these studies tend benefits of market participation, but it's kind of in line with what the IMMs have found in the East, I pointed earlier to the kind of pattern energy study that Potomac Energy Economics study, I should say, that showed about $150 to $300 million for the eastern markets, which are much bigger on a load and generation size. So I think this kind of intuitive and fits in and gives you a sense of like what's on the table, right? What stands to be gained if this can be implemented effectively, or what stands to be lost if it's not in the West. Okay, and then the last slide I have is slide 96. If we go there, this comes from that same study. And I just wanted to point out, you know, in all of these market scenarios, so again, the range of scenarios going from bookend to bookend, we still see something like 150 terawatt hours of trading in the West, the bilateral trading, I should say. So in those cases where, you know, the day ahead markets, one or the other, cover basically the entire West, this bilateral trading is really seams trading. So this is kind of where that value of intertie optimization lies, is by taking that bilateral trading at the market seams and maybe making it more efficient, driving out some of the hurdles related to that trading and therefore extracting more value for customers. So I'll leave it there. I think that's all I have. Happy to answer more questions.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for hanging with us through the audio challenges. So we're going to do a Q&A session now. Jay, okay, I'll be going. We'll take about 10 minutes. See what kind of questions we get. So to begin with, just want to start and check if any of the RIF liaisons from the sectors have any questions to kick things off. And we have one from Scott. I'm going to hand Sienna a microphone. Okay.
Thanks, Ali. Scott Olson with Avangrid, and my question is largely for Richard, but certainly Todd, interested in your perspective too. One of the big discussions in the Markets Plus Seams working group is how to model the California ISO. Should it be one hub? Should it be two hubs, given sometimes nice differentials between NP15 and SP15? SPP staff has talked about their experience in the seam between SPP and MISO, where they do just model MISO as one price. Or I have very little experience in MISO, so you have quite a bit. So wanted to get your perspective to say, how has that worked historically between SPP and MISO, having just one price in MISO? And do you think that's a apt analogy for modeling SPP and EDAM or the California ISO?
So hear me okay? Yeah, great. Very confusing. The micro windows, you haven't used it. You know, it's a hard question. And the reason that most of the RTOs in the East went with a single interchange node is to avoid gaming problems. The recognition that along a long seam, you're going to have big potential price differences. And you saw that in one of the maps where you had very high negative prices in MISO in the northwestern portion, and when you went all the way down to the south, much higher prices. And so it would have been nice in that case to have the ability to arbitrage those between two markets, because it's a physical constraint that's stopping the movement within the arc. So you lose that ability when you only have one price node. But the trade-off, having two price nodes, is the gaming opportunities for people to engage in the types of round trip trading that unfortunately West has some very unpleasant experience with in the past. And that's why there's only one price node. I think it's going to be complicated if you have actually non-contiguous zones. I don't know how you do one price node.
Thank you. All three of you, Todd. John, thanks for hanging in there. And Richard, this is Vijay, public interest liaison. So, question I have for, I think, all three of you will be, but I think Richard and John, you're confirming. One of your slides said something, Richard, about if you something to do with bilateral trading. So we have few markets being set up where others can correct me if I'm mistaken. Existing bilateral contracts are being folded into the market design and structure. So are we already accepting the inefficiency from bilateral trading, and you top it off with seams formation? So how is that going to be measurable? And is it better to go completely flow-based to reduce the internal seam that we talked about? So I'm just curious about that in terms of dispatch and bilateral trading. Would be prudent to move towards blinding out bilateral trading contracts in the long term?
I understand the question. I doubt you will ever get rid of bilateral trading contracts. They have a lot of value for both generators and load. They allow them to lock in forward positions, which is a risk mitigation practice that most market participants are using to some extent. So I think it would be unfortunate to get rid of bilateral trading. In a well-functioning spot market, bilateral trading is disciplined by spot prices and by participants' expectations and risk tolerance. And so those two should work together very well. Get the efficiency that you get with a centrally cleared market, and you also have bilateral trading people engaging the rest that they have.
But I agree. I also just wanted, it sort of reminded me that I should have said something earlier about complexity that maybe relates, is that in this process, nobody has proposed consolidating boats or consolidating BAAs. So we're gonna keep all of that. And not everybody is gonna be in the same market and we're not proposing LTOs, et cetera. So I think by that nature also, I think bilateral trading and even tagging, there'll still be a robust set of tags out there because we'll have to have them. People have to do interchange schedule and account for the rights they're using on different people's systems. So in addition to the forward positions, people like the lock in with bilateral trading.
John, do you want to add anything on that discussion?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I would kind of echo what Richard said. Even in kind of the East, we still see bilateral contracts. They function in a very different way than in the West, but they still serve a purpose from like shielding counterparties from risk and market risk and things like that. So I don't know that we'll ever get away from that, but I do think, as we think about markets evolving in the West, consolidating the OATs, consolidating the balancing authorities are ways that you can mitigate a lot of seams. I really liked Todd's kind of long list of seams that exist. Some of the ways you mitigate those seams could be by consolidating operations even more than what's been proposed so far, under Markets Plus and EDAM. So that's one avenue to think about as the market, and as a result, kind of like reduce the number of seams that we have in the West.
Thanks. All right.
If I get just 5 seconds onto that last answer. Bilaterals are important, and one of the big issues with seams is it shrinks the universe of bilateral opportunities people have. You're stuck with contracting people who are in your immediate vicinity because you're doing it for risk mitigation. To the extent you have large and unhedgeable risk trying to buy from the neighbor, you don't know what the price risk is associated with that. You're very unlikely to engage in that. Capacity trading has all but been completely eliminated between MISO and BJM. For that reason, it's just too risky. No one's willing to answer.
Hey, Lindsay Schleppway with the EI and entity sector. John, I just wanted to say thank you for providing the two potential solutions that the East has undergone respect to seams. But one thing I was curious, and I'd like to hear from each of the panelists, is whether or not you have an opinion about whether the Eastern model is something that we could actually do in the West, since we are going to retain our balancing authority areas and we're going to have markets in different time horizons. Those are new complexities that the East hasn't undergone. So is this even something we can start with?
So I think for the base model for how you deal with congestion management, yeah, absolutely. We can do that if you want scenarios. When the MISO market first started in 2005, we had balancing areas for each of the transmission and utilities. We had not collapsed balancing areas at that point. There was only one tariff, but that really isn't very important. What's important for congestion management is more the agreement about how you're going to be monitoring the system, allocating rights, and assigning responsibility for curtailment of congestion flow gates. And you can do all of that with multiple tariffs. The city's management agreement between the RTOs are agreements that are embedded in the both tariffs of the RTOs as well as other non-market counterparties that might have a role to play. So all of that can work with multiple balancing areas, multiple transmission owners, multiple holes. It's hard, but it can all work.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I agree with what Richard said there. Those agreements serve as a good starting point. The other thing too is there are lessons to learn about that. I think Richard it was who talked about the MISO North, MISO South kind of contract path arrangement that exists between those two areas of MISO. I think that's going to be useful for the markets in the West to look at as a model on how to operate these markets if they end up being discontiguous. So that's definitely a good example. I think, coordinated transaction scheduling could work in the West too. I think the question though is it even worth implementing given the results in the East? So it certainly, I think those things could work. That type of arrangement could work, but in a lot of ways, I think the West actually has shown a good example to the East on with the imbalanced markets that are functioning there today on how to do this better in some ways.
And this is Todd. I don't feel qualified to talk about the Eastern tools, but I am familiar with how we do congestion management in the West, familiar with the ECC tool, as well as the enhancements that have been proposed. And I agree, there's hope there for sure to have a common congestion management process that's well coordinated between multiple market operators. I think the key there, though, is still going to be all of the various OATs and transmission rights, and people buy transmission of various types as a hedge. And so they're going to be very interested in making sure those congestion management processes recognize their quality of their rights.
All right, thank you. Okay, I think we have time for. I know we have a lot of questions. I think we have time for one more. So go to. I think Sybil was first. Well, let's do the microphone because we're hard for people on the phone to hear.
My apologies. It's actually a follow-up to this. What I think I'm hearing is that universal approach to congestion management is the starting place for active seams management. And so I was wondering if you could each bit on sort of, is that a true precursor to having any sort of, economic optimization between these? Or sort of what do you do in the meantime? Or as we transition to developing that in the West? It does sound like it's a pretty important tool to have in place, given low issues, etc.
Well, oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say, I think Richard said it before. Step one is making sure you don't blow up your neighbor's market. So that definitely has to get in there first. So that goes down to the joint operating agreements and the congestion management and any shared flow gates and making sure any loop flows you cause on your neighboring systems don't, have huge economic impact in those systems. So I mean that's going to happen pretty fast. And if it doesn't, and it does cause big economic issues, there's going to be challenges about it, and there's going to be, you know, contested issues about it in front of FERC or in the courts. Like that's what happened in MISO, which I'm sure Richard can speak to even more than I can. So to me, that almost has to happen right away if there's issues.
Yeah, this is Todd. You know, I think back to you know, years before Bonneville joined the energy balance market, we had worked with the California ISO to make sure that they were modeling our system, had our flow gates model, could calculate market flows and the impacts of the California market or the energy balance market on our system. And then eventually, and manage the dynamic flows that we thought might show up. And, you know, we continue to work with California to develop some various types of congestion management processes and protocols that we ended up documenting in essentially a SEAMS agreement. So it seems completely possible to extend that to day ahead and even to make sure that there's parity in the types of tools and capabilities in both markets, and a way to jointly coordinate the market flows that show up from the activities of each market in such a way that, you know, the limits that a transmission operator sets and the rights that market participants have are honored and managed and done in a, you know, collaborative and economic and efficient way. I think we can do that.
I would say the simple answer is yes. The question is a prerequisite in order to get to the next step, which would be more efficiency enhancing versions of SEAMS coordination, like joint congestion management, market congestion management, where you're minimizing the cost of managing congestion. That first step of just getting to where you can reliably manage load flow is necessary, and that does lead to a lot of problems if you don't get it done. Most recent example, even after you agree on how much you can use of each other's systems and who's going to pay who, if you have to reduce congestion, you still end up with disagreements. The most recent in MISO, it may still be playing out in the courts. $42 million that Montana Dakota Utility has paid for a congestion on the SDP system that MISO is redispatching for. So because of the nature of the agreement, MISO has the responsibility to redispatch that congested flow gate. A large data center was built in a load pocket, causing a lot of congestion on the MISO system. And it's a classic example of loop flow from one market having a very big impact on the neighbor. And if you don't have some process in place to deal with that first from a reliability perspective, that's the don't burn down your neighbor's system problem. Someone's got to unload that constraint. And if the local utility can't, the neighbor's got to help out. You've got to have coordination there on it. And then ultimately you'd like to get to that market mechanisms to make that work as efficiently as possible. That it's absolutely necessary to have some congestion management, basic joint operating agreement protocols and systems in place. And you're going to have two large markets dispatching and committing resources right next to each other. You're just going to have big loop flows. They're going to have.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry we're not able to take more questions, but I think all three panelists have shared their email addresses in the presentation. So feel free to reach out to Todd or John or Richard. On behalf of the RIF team, I want to thank you all for being here. My simple takeaway is, for those who may not know, back in the day, 28, 30 years ago, when I was a kid in India, we had a program within the condo to share resources, especially food resources, whenever somebody needed more supply. So what you basically remind me of is plan ahead and know your neighbor's system, and you are prepared to have a mitigation plan in case somebody else's system is short on resources or causes undue burden to your system. So I think you all will agree in saying that this is the interesting time in the West, and let's get on it. And thank you for presenting your perspectives. I appreciate it. And thank you to the board members and Vice Chair Joette for being here as well. Thank you. And I'll give it back to Madam Chair.
Great, thank you. And one thing I'd add, if there, I know we didn't get to a lot of questions from attendees today. If you do have follow-on questions, both which I suggested contacting the panelists, as well as if you have particular topics or suggestions for the second panel that we mentioned we'll be doing in June, we would welcome those. Please share those with your liaison and or directly with myself and Vijay, whose contact is also on the direct contact list. We'd welcome input as we plan for that. So just a few things in closing. So can we go to, yes, thank you, perfect. So a few logistic things, just if you are not on the RIP email list, you can subscribe to that email list to make sure that you're getting updates on the Western energy markets and on the CAISO and on upcoming RIP events. Also related to our opening session on the roadmap and the roundtable, on the policy initiative, just a reminder, if you haven't seen it, that the ISO currently has the prioritization survey open as part of the policy initiative's roadmap process, and that is open until April 29th. That went out in the market notices. It's also available on the 2025 roadmap page on the initiative site. So I just want to echo a huge thank you to our panelists and to the RIF liaisons who contributed to planning and executing this meeting. Thank you to everyone for attending and contributing with your questions. And a huge thanks to Pacificor and Vijay Singh for hosting the meeting and helping with all the coordination today. We really appreciate that. And as Meg mentioned at the beginning, I'm taking over as chair, so I want to take a moment to thank Meg McNall for her amazing leadership as RIF chair over the past year. Meg has done an excellent job of not only guiding the day-to-day of the Regional Issues Forum, but also leading a lot of engagement with Pathways and the ISO to work on the RIF enhancements work. And we've done quite a few sets of comments over the past year, as well as the first roundtable report. So she leaves big shoes to fill, but has been a great mentor in how to do this job. And I am looking forward to the leadership of the next year with Lindsay and Vijay Singh stepping into roles from the EIM entities and newly formed EDM entity sector, respectively. We have a lot of exciting work ahead on the RIF in the next year, so we look forward to engaging with you all on our RIF enhancements work and collaboration on stakeholder initiatives. Definitely would put a plug again to please submit comments, any thoughts you have on our proposed enhancement plan. If we go to the next slide, I just want to note that we do have our next meeting on the calendar, and that is scheduled for June 17th. That one will be held in Reno, Nevada, so we're making our way around the region. It will be the day before a governing body meeting on June 18th. So we hope to see many of you at that meeting in person or virtually. So with that, we'll wrap up today's Regional Issues Forum meeting. Thank you, and everyone has a great afternoon.